The rain hitting the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Tribeca loft sounded like static. I stood by the glass, holding a cup of black coffee, watching the headlights crawl across the Manhattan Bridge. It was 10 at night. 12 hours earlier, I had stood on the balcony of the New York Stock Exchange and pressed a button that valued my software company at $103 million. 12 hours earlier, the financial world had finally learned my name. But the intercom buzzing in the quiet of my kitchen had nothing to do with Wall Street reporters. It was the night concierge telling me my parents were in the lobby. The same parents who had spent my entire adult life treating my ambition like a contagious disease. I told the concierge to send them up. I wanted to see it. I wanted to see what 3 decades of condescension looked like when it was forced to stare at a 9-figure valuation. The private elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. My father Richard stepped out first. His trench coat was damp, his shoulders slumped in a way I had never witnessed. My mother Evelyn followed him, clutching her leather handbag so tightly her knuckles were white. The sharp, polished arrogance they wore like armor was gone. They stood in the foyer of a penthouse that cost more than their entire investment portfolio, and they looked small. My mother broke first. Her perfectly manicured facade crumbled into an ugly, unscripted sob. She stepped forward, reaching out to touch my arm. She told me they were drowning. She told me the family estate was facing foreclosure, that they had leveraged everything to maintain their lifestyle, and that my new wealth was the only thing that could save the Sinclair name from ruin. My father, the man who had relentlessly mocked my intelligence, cleared his throat and held out a shaking hand. He looked at the imported hardwood under his shoes and asked me for a bailout. He used the word family. He said, "Family helps family." I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. I looked at the man who had laughed at my dreams in crowded rooms, and I asked him one cold, level question. Wasn't my company worthless? Welcome back to Morning Revenge, where we sit with the people who were laughed out of the room and watch what happens when they end up buying the building. If you have ever had your hard work treated like a joke by the people who were supposed to protect you, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment telling me your age and where you are listening from, and be sure to subscribe so the next story finds you. My name is Audrey Sinclair, and the trap that caught my parents was set 3 weeks before they showed up crying in my foyer. It started in a private alcove at a French restaurant in Midtown, the kind of place that smells like white truffles and old money. The lighting was low, designed to make diamonds catch the flicker of candlelight. We were there to celebrate my older sister. Victoria had just been named vice president at a legacy investment bank. In my family, that title was the only currency that mattered. I sat at the edge of the table nursing a glass of sparkling water. I wore a plain dark blazer. My hair was tied back. My nails were unpolished. Victoria sat across from me in emerald silk, looking like a magazine spread about corporate dominance. My father sat at the head of the table, adjusting his tailored cuffs. My mother sat beside him, directing the waiters with slight imperious flicks of her wrist. For 2 hours, I listened to the three of them speak the only language they respected. They talked about mergers board seats and corner offices. They traded names of managing directors and golf course memberships. I kept my gaze on the rim of my water glass, tracing the condensation with my index finger. I was 32 years old and running a financial technology startup out of a windowless brick office in Brooklyn. I was writing code that would eventually render Victoria's entire banking department obsolete. But in that alcove, I was just the disappointment who refused to get a real job. Growing up, the Sinclair household operated on a strict ledger. My parents measured human worth by pedigree and conventional prestige. Victoria followed the blueprint flawlessly. She went to the right schools, joined the right firms, and married a man who traded commodities. She was the pristine asset. I was the liability. I had skipped the corporate ladder to build something from the ground up. I spent my 20s living on ramen noodles and pitching to angel investors who told me my algorithms were too ambitious. My parents did not see the grit in that struggle. They only saw the lack of a recognizable title. Marcus, a wealthy family friend who had joined us for dessert, leaned forward and looked at me. His smile was polite, but his eyes held that specific pity reserved for the black sheep. "Audrey," he said, swirling his cognac, "how is that little computer project of yours coming along? Still trying to disrupt the big boys?" I opened my mouth to give a neutral, polite answer, but my father did not let me form the words. Richard Sinclair let out a rich baritone laugh. It echoed off the mahogany walls. "Oh, Marcus, let us not bore the table with that. Audrey is playing tech CEO. It is a cute phase, but ultimately a worthless digital pipe dream. We are just hoping she transitions into a real career before her 30s slip away entirely." I felt my jaw tighten. I felt a sharp urge to reach into my bag, pull out my laptop, and show them the user acquisition metrics that were currently making venture capitalists sweat. I wanted to scream that my platform was processing thousands of transactions per second. I wanted to tell my father that his beloved traditional banks were quietly trying to license my software. I took a slow breath and let the urge pass. New York had taught me a brutal lesson early on. Leverage is never spoken, it is deployed. Arguing with my father was like negotiating with a brick wall. He did not want to understand my work. He wanted me to fail so his worldview would remain intact. He needed me to be the struggling artist of the family so Victoria's success would shine brighter by contrast. My mother smiled, her eyes gleaming with a practiced venomous warmth. "Speaking of real careers," she purred. She reached under her chair and produced a square velvet box, sliding it across the white linen toward Victoria. "For our new vice president." Victoria snapped the box open. Nestled in the white satin was a vintage Cartier tank watch. The gold caught the candlelight. Victoria lifted it out with a quiet sigh of triumph and fastened it around her wrist. It looked heavy. It looked exactly like the kind of shackle my parents used to keep her in line. She held her wrist up, turning it so the gold flashed in my direction. My mother then reached into her designer clutch. She pulled out a small, flat rectangle of plastic and placed it on the tablecloth. She pushed it toward me with one manicured finger. It stopped inches from my plate. "And for you, sweetheart," she said. Her voice dripped with manufactured sympathy. "A $50 gift card to that coffee chain you like. I know those late-night coding games keep you up. You need the caffeine more than we do." I stared at the plastic card. A green siren logo smiling up at me. A decade of grinding work, sleepless nights eating stale pretzels over a glowing keyboard, building a proprietary algorithm from scratch, pitch of rooms full of hostile men in suits, surviving server crashes and payroll panics, processed and evaluated by my own mother and deemed worth exactly $50 of roasted beans. Victoria took a sip of her champagne, hiding a smirk behind the crystal rim. My father went back to discussing bond yields with Marcus. They had delivered the verdict. The unmeasured daughter had been weighed and dismissed. I reached out and picked up the plastic card. It felt light and cheap in my fingers. "Thank you, Mom," I said. My voice was perfectly flat, betraying nothing. I slipped the card into my blazer pocket. As I lowered my hand, my phone buzzed against my thigh. A single sharp vibration. I did not take the phone out and place it on the table. That would invite questions I was not ready to answer. I kept my hand in my pocket, pressing my thumb against the side button to wake the screen. I tilted the device just enough to read the notification, glowing through the dark fabric. It was a secure email from my lead underwriter at Goldman. The subject line was 3 words long, but they carried the weight of a freight train. Swan officially approved. My lungs expanded. The air in the private alcove suddenly felt very thin. The Securities and Exchange Commission had formally greenlit my initial public offering. The long, agonizing runway was over. The countdown to the New York Stock Exchange had silently engaged. Within 3 weeks, my worthless digital pipe dream was going to be priced by the global market. I looked across the table. Victoria was admiring her vintage watch. My mother was signaling the waiter for the check. My father was straightening his silk tie, looking exceedingly pleased with the empire he thought he controlled. None of them had any idea that the ground beneath their chairs had just fractured. I let go of my phone and reached for my water glass. The condensation was cold against my palm. I took a slow, deliberate sip and offered my family a serene, unbroken smile. The air in the lobby of my sister's legacy investment bank felt heavy, filtered through decades of institutional arrogance. I stepped off the express elevator on the 42nd floor 2 days after our dinner at the French restaurant. Victoria had summoned me. The word felt antiquated, resembling a monarch calling for a disobedient subject, but it was the only accurate verb for the situation. Her assistant, a young man trapped in a pristine charcoal suit, did not bother asking for my name. He merely scanned my practical trench coat, noted my flat boots, and pointed a manicured finger toward the corner office at the end of the hall. I walked past rows of junior analysts staring blankly at dual monitors. They were the grunts of the financial world, analyzing data through outdated models. They were the exact workforce my software was designed to render obsolete. They typed furiously, unaware that a woman walking past them in a damp coat was about to automate their entire department. Victoria sat behind an imposing slab of polished mahogany. The New York skyline stretched out behind her, forming a jagged gray tapestry of steel and glass. She did not stand when I entered. She gestured casually to a low leather guest chair positioned across from her. I sank into it, feeling the deliberate psychological disadvantage of the seating arrangement. The chair was designed to make the occupant feel small, to force them to look up at the executive. Victoria picked up a silver pen from her leather blotter. The metal caught the harsh fluorescent light overhead. I recognized the instrument immediately. Our father had given it to her upon her graduation from business school. It had her initials deeply engraved near the clip. She began to tap it rhythmically against the glass edge of her mahogany desk. Click, click, click. The sound was a physical manifestation of the metric my family used to measure human value, a ruler made of silver and impatience ticking away the seconds of my supposed failure. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. She wore a soft gray cashmere sweater that radiated approachable superiority. "Audrey," she began using her maternal, highly concerned tone. "Mom and Dad are worried. I am worried. You look exhausted. Your skin is pale. You are wearing yourself down to the bone for a project that has no traction." I kept my posture perfectly straight. "I am working long hours, Victoria," I replied. "Startups require momentum. The initial build phase is always demanding." She sighed a sound meant to convey deep, tragic sympathy for my ignorance. "A startup implies a starting line, Audrey. You have been running on a stationary treadmill for years. You are spinning your wheels and generating nothing but stress. It is time to step off before you embarrass yourself, before you embarrass the family name any further. We have a reputation in this city, a standard." I watched the silver pen rotate in her fingers. She was not asking for a life update. She was setting a trap. I waited in silence, letting her fill the void. "I spoke to the head of our global infrastructure division this morning," Victoria continued, her tone shifting from concerned sister to benevolent dictator. "We are restructuring the back-office IT department. They handle server maintenance, internal ticket routing, and hardware troubleshooting. It is not glamorous, but it is stable. It is safe. I told him my little sister was looking for a soft landing. I pulled some heavy strings, Audrey. I can get you an analyst tier salary, full health benefits, a matching retirement account. You can put this tech fantasy to bed and finally start building a legitimate career under a respected corporate umbrella." The sheer audacity of the offer settled over me like a suffocating blanket. She was offering me a job fixing broken printers for the exact bankers my algorithms were about to replace. She was offering me a spot at the very bottom of her food chain so she could supervise my mediocrity. She needed me to be a subordinate. My failure validated her sacrifices. It justified the long, miserable hours she spent climbing a rigid corporate ladder someone else built. If I succeeded outside of her system, it meant her entire worldview was a lie. She needed to save me to prove that she was right. I looked at the Cartier watch gleaming on her wrist, marking the time of my surrender. I looked at the silver pen still tapping against the glass. I looked at my sister. "Thank you for the thought, Victoria," I said. My voice was calm, devoid of the defensive edge she was waiting to provoke. "But I am not looking for a job. My company is exactly where it needs to be right now." The maternal mask slid off her face and shattered on the polished mahogany. The silver pen stopped tapping, her jaw locked. Her green eyes, the same shade as our mother's, narrowed into cold, unforgiving slits. "You are 32 years old, Audrey." She spat the words flying across the desk like loose gravel. "You live in a cramped shoebox in Brooklyn. You wear out-of-season clothes. You are a ghost at networking events. Dad is tired of making excuses for you to his partners at the country club. I am tired of covering for your delusions when my colleagues ask what my sister does for a living. If you reject this lifeline, do not expect the safety net to catch you when you inevitably crash." I raised a single brow, keeping my hands folded in my lap. Safety net. Victoria leaned across the desk, her cashmere suddenly looking very rigid. The family trust, she hissed, dropping the final anchor. Dad is meeting with his estate attorney next week. He is seriously considering excising your portion entirely. He refuses to fund a sinking ship. We are cutting you off, Audrey. End of discussion. I sat there in the low leather chair and felt a profound, chilling urge to laugh. I swallowed it down, trapping it in my chest, where it blossomed into pure clarity. The threat was a ghost story, meant to scare a disobedient child. Victoria truly believed the trust fund was the invisible leash keeping me tethered to their expectations. She assumed my startup was surviving on parental handouts. She did not know I had quietly declined my distributions half a decade ago. I had not taken a single dime of Sinclair money in 5 years. Every server I rented, every developer I hired, every late-night meal I expensed was paid for by venture capitalists who saw the future written in my code. My father was threatening to close a bank account I had already emptied. The leverage they thought they held over my throat was entirely imaginary. I stood up, slowly refusing to grant her the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. I smoothed the front of my trench coat. Do what you feel is best for the family portfolio, Victoria, I told her. Tell Dad I support his estate planning decisions. I turned and walked out of the corner office. I did not look back to see her reaction. I strode past the rows of analysts, past the pristine assistant, and stepped into the elevator. The descent made my ears pop. I walked out of the revolving glass doors and onto the pavement. The biting Wall Street wind whipped down the urban canyon, cutting straight through my coat. It was freezing and it felt magnificent. The air was sharp, clean, and alive. Away from the recycled oxygen of the Legacy Bank, my mind cleared. The family had drawn their line in the sand. They had officially discarded me. It was the most liberating moment of my life. I checked my phone. I had 45 minutes until my next meeting. I walked 4 blocks north, ignoring the tourists taking photos of the bronze charging bull. I entered a sleek, unmarked building and took a private, secure elevator to the top floor. The doors opened directly into the polished concrete foyer of the city's most aggressive venture capital firm. My lead investor was waiting in the main boardroom. The syndicate agreement lay open on a massive slate table. Blue ink flags marked the signature lines. The legal team stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, murmuring quietly among themselves. I approached the table and picked up a plain black ballpoint pen resting near the documents. It was not engraved with my initials. It was not a gift from my father. It was just a tool. I scanned the final page of the agreement. The institutional demand for my stock had vastly outpaced all of our conservative projections. The roadshow had been a silent triumph. The syndicate had officially priced the impending initial public offering. I signed my name, Audrey Sinclair, on the bottom line binding the agreement and securing the structure. I set the cheap plastic pen down on the slate. My worthless little startup was going to open trading at a staggering valuation. The trap I had been quietly building in the dark was now fully armed and locked. The humming of the cooling fans in my Brooklyn server room normally sounded like progress. Today, it sounded like a countdown. We were exactly 3 weeks away from the initial public offering, and the architecture of my platform was undergoing a critical migration. My lead engineer, David, stood illuminated by the harsh blue glow of 3 monitors, rubbing his temples. He delivered the news with the quiet dread of a man watching a dam fracture. The cloud infrastructure provider required an immediate security escrow to scale our back-end capacity for the anticipated public launch volume. The figure was $200,000. It was a standard operational hurdle for a rapidly scaling startup, but the timing was disastrous. The institutional funds from the syndicate agreement were securely locked in a holding account, pending the opening bell. I had built this company on razor-thin margins, funneling every available cent into development and talent. My primary venture backer, the man who usually handled these brief logistical gaps, was currently somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, entirely unreachable for the next 48 hours. The commercial bank required a guarantor by the end of the business day to issue the short-term line of credit. If the migration stalled, the entire public offering schedule would collapse, resulting in millions of dollars in penalties and a catastrophic loss of investor confidence. I needed a signature. I did not need cash. I just needed a high net worth individual to put their name on a piece of paper guaranteeing a 48-hour bridge loan. It was a moment of agonizing vulnerability. For 5 years, I had fiercely protected my independence, refusing to ask my family for a single favor. But the ticking clock left me cornered. I swallowed my pride, grabbed my keys, and drove north toward Westchester County. The transition from the gritty, industrial streets of Brooklyn to the manicured, sprawling estates of my childhood neighborhood felt like traveling between different planets. The Sinclair residence sat at the end of a long, circular gravel driveway, flanked by ancient oak trees. It was a house built to project stability and intimidate outsiders. I found my father in his mahogany-paneled study. The room smelled of lemon oil, old paper, and expensive cigars. Richard Sinclair sat in a wingback leather chair with a soft cloth in his hand. He was meticulously polishing a set of antique hickory golf clubs. He did not look up when I stepped through the heavy oak door. The rhythmic squeak of the polishing cloth against the metal iron was the only sound in the room. I approached his desk and laid the commercial banking folder on the polished wood. I kept my voice steady, stripping away any hint of desperation. I have a temporary logistical gap, Dad, I explained. The public offering is 3 weeks away, and we are migrating servers to handle the volume. I need a guarantor for a short-term credit line. It is a strict formality to satisfy the bank algorithms until my lead investor lands in Tokyo tomorrow. Zero capital is required from you. I just need your signature to secure the bridge. The polishing cloth continued its rhythm. Squeak, squeak, squeak. He turned the vintage golf club in his hands, inspecting the brass trim. He did not even glance at the folder resting inches from his elbow. "This is what happens when you build a house on sand, Audrey," my father said. His baritone voice was smooth, unbothered, and laced with profound condescension. "You run out of runway. You hit a wall. You come crawling back to the adults, asking us to fix the mess." I pressed my fingertips against the edge of the desk. "I am not asking you to fix a mess. I am asking for a routine signature on a standard corporate bridge loan. The company is valued at 9 figures. The risk is non-existent." He finally stopped polishing. He set the golf club across his lap and looked up at me. His eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely devoid of paternal warmth. "A real Sinclair does not beg for imaginary money to fund a failing hobby," he stated. "The market is speaking to you, Audrey. It is telling you that this little digital fantasy is over. This hurdle is the universe delivering a message. It is time to fold the company, declare bankruptcy, and accept the reality of your situation. Victoria offered you a perfectly respectable position in her IT department. You threw it in her face. I will not put my name on a piece of paper to prolong your inevitable failure." The air in the study felt suddenly heavy, pressing against my chest. I stared at the man sitting in the leather chair, and a terrifying clarity washed over me. He was not protecting his assets. He knew the bridge loan was safe. He understood the mechanics of corporate finance better than anyone. He was refusing the signature because he wanted the migration to fail. He wanted the initial public offering to collapse. He needed my company to burn to the ground so I would be forced to return to his empire, defeated and compliant. My success was a direct threat to the rigid hierarchy he had spent his life building. He did not just doubt my abilities, he actively hungered for my ruin. The realization hollowed me out, leaving a freezing clinical void where my remaining daughterly hope had been. The pain of the rejection evaporated, replaced by a sharp, metallic survival instinct. I did not argue, I did not plead. I simply reached across the mahogany desk, picked up the folder, and turned around. I walked out of the study, out of the sprawling estate, and into the crisp autumn air. The tension inside me had shifted permanently. I was no longer seeking his approval. I was going to war. I drove back into Manhattan, breaking several speed limits along the way. I bypassed my office and headed straight for a sleek, minimalist building in Soho. It was the headquarters of Diana Vance. Diana was a self-made angel investor who had built her fortune in the brutal commercial real estate markets of the 90s. She was a woman who wore sharp, tailored suits, kept her silver hair cut ruthlessly short, and tolerated zero fools. She had reviewed my initial seed round years ago. She had passed on the investment at the time, citing the early-stage risk, but she had looked me in the eye and told me I had the spine of a killer. We had kept in touch, trading brief emails about market trends. She was the only person in the city formidable enough to underwrite the bridge without blinking. Her assistant ushered me into a stark white office with exposed brick walls. Diana sat behind a glass table reviewing a printed spreadsheet. She looked up and read my posture instantly. "You look like a woman holding a live grenade," she noted, setting her pen down. I handed her the folder. "I need a $200,000 bridge loan for exactly 48 hours, I said, matching her directness. "The server migration is stalling. My lead is over the Pacific. If I do not secure this escrow by 5 o'clock, my public offering schedule collapses." Diana opened the folder. She did not ask for a pitch. She did not lecture me on responsibility. She read the terms, scanned the underwriting requirements, and picked up her pen. She operated on mathematics and intuition, not ego. She signed her name on the guarantor line with swift, precise strokes. As she slid the folder back across the glass table, she studied my face. Her dark eyes caught the lingering shadow of the encounter in Westchester. "You went to your family first," she deduced, her voice softening slightly but losing none of its edge. "And they left you bleeding on the pavement?" I nodded slowly, sliding the signed document into my leather bag. "My father believes the universe is telling me to quit." Diana leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Let me give you a piece of advice that costs far more than the signature I just provided Audrey. When you build something valuable, the people who dismissed you will try to claim it. When they cannot claim it, they will try to destroy it." She tilted her head, her gaze piercing right through me. "Blood is often the most toxic liability on a balance sheet. Watch your back." I thanked her and rushed to the commercial bank, filing the paperwork with 30 minutes to spare. The servers migrated, the architecture scaled, the crisis was averted. But as I sat in my quiet apartment that night staring out at the glowing skyline, I could not shake Diana's warning. The bridge was secured, but the vulnerability had been exposed. By asking my father for help, I had inadvertently signaled to my family that I was nearing the finish line. I had shown them my throat. And I knew, with chilling certainty, that Victoria, with her deep connections in the financial sector, would not simply sit back and watch me succeed. If my father refused to help me survive, my sister would undoubtedly try to ensure I did not. The financial ecosystem of Manhattan operates exactly like a high school cafeteria, governed by people wearing bespoke suits. Despite the sprawling skyscrapers and the billions of dollars changing hands daily, the actual network of power is remarkably insular. Information is the primary currency, and gossip travels faster than algorithmic trading. If a significant signature lands on a commercial banking document in the morning, the tremors are felt in the executive dining rooms by noon. Victoria thrived in this environment. She spent her days navigating the invisible currents of corporate favors, whispered alliances, and strategic lunches. It took less than 48 hours for the news of my bridge loan to cross her mahogany desk. A junior analyst at the commercial bank, eager to impress a newly minted vice president, casually mentioned that Diana Vance had underwritten a short-term credit line for a startup founder named Sinclair. I did not know about the leaked information immediately. I was sitting in my Brooklyn office late on a Thursday evening debugging a string of code when my cell phone vibrated against the metal desk. The caller ID displayed Diana's private office line. A sudden spike of adrenaline pierced my chest. In the delicate weeks preceding an initial public offering, a late evening phone call from your primary guarantor rarely signals good news. I answered on the second ring, expecting a banking error or a revoked signature. Instead, Diana's assistant delivered a crisp instruction. "Diana requires your presence in Soho, right now." I grabbed my coat and caught the subway into Manhattan. The rhythmic clatter of the train against the tracks matched my racing pulse. I ran through every possible technical failure, every potential compliance breach. By the time I walked into the stark white lobby of Diana's headquarters, my nerves were drawn tight as wire. The office was empty save for Diana herself. She sat behind her glass table, illuminated by the glow of a single desk lamp. The rain had started again, casting long, distorted shadows across the exposed brick walls. She wore a dark turtleneck and held a crystal glass of sparkling water. Resting directly in front of her was a small, leather-bound notebook. "Have a seat, Audrey," she directed, gesturing to the chair opposite her. I sat down, keeping my posture rigid. "Is there a problem with the escrow?" I asked, striving to keep my voice level. The escrow cleared flawlessly, Diana replied, taking a slow sip of her water. The servers are migrating. Your back-end architecture is secure. The problem sitting on my desk has nothing to do with technology. It has to do with biology. She leaned forward and opened the leather notebook. The pages were filled with sharp, angular handwriting. I had lunch today at Le Bernardin, she continued. The invitation came highly recommended by a mutual acquaintance in the legacy banking sector. A newly promoted vice president reached out, requesting a private audience. She claimed she wanted to discuss emerging market trends, but she spent the entire appetizer course asking very pointed questions about my recent investments. Specifically, she wanted to know why a veteran like me would risk my capital on an unproven, erratic founder. My stomach plummeted, hitting the floor of the Soho office. The air in the room suddenly tasted metallic. Victoria Diana stated, closing the notebook with a soft thud. Your older sister is an exceptionally elegant assassin. I have negotiated with corporate raiders and hostile takeover specialists, but I must admit her technique was mesmerizing. She never raised her voice. She never leveled a direct accusation. She simply painted a masterpiece of subtle doubt. I stared at the glass table, unable to form a response. The betrayal was so profound, it temporarily paralyzed my vocal cords. Under the guise of protecting an industry peer, Diana elaborated, your sister expressed deep sisterly concern for your mental health. She implied that you are financially unstable. She shared fabricated anecdotes about you abandoning ambitious projects in your youth whenever the pressure mounted. She suggested that your current venture is a manic episode disguised as a business, and she strongly advised me to withdraw my support before you inevitably collapse and take my investment down with you. The words hung in the quiet office. I closed my eyes, and the memories rushed forward. Victoria deliberately breaking my middle school science fair project because it was too complicated. Victoria telling our parents I was not suited for advanced calculus because I lacked the temperament. It was the same script recycled and upgraded for a Wall Street audience. She was trying to sever my lifeline. She wanted the bridge loan pulled. She wanted the public offering to fail so she could welcome me back to her department as a defeated subordinate. Diana watched me intently. Her dark eyes scrutinized every micro-expression on my face. She was waiting for the explosion. The pressure inside my chest was blinding. Every instinct demanded retaliation. I wanted to scream. I wanted to pull out my phone, call Victoria, and unleash decades of suppressed rage. I wanted to tell Diana about the insulting job offer, about the Cartier watch, about the $50 gift card. I wanted to drag my family's toxic dynamics into the light and wage a scorched earth campaign against my own blood. But I looked at the veteran investor sitting across from me, and I realized something crucial. Defending myself verbally would only make me look defensive. Engaging in a frantic, emotional explanation would validate Victoria's claim that I was erratic. If I started a family war in Diana's office, I would lose her respect permanently. I forced my jaw to unclench. I commanded my heart rate to slow. I locked the rage in a tight, lightless box at the back of my mind. I reached into my leather briefcase. The zipper sounded excessively loud in the silent room. I pulled out a single, crisp manila folder. I did not say a word about my sister. I did not offer a single defensive syllable regarding my mental health or my financial stability. Instead, I opened the folder and extracted my updated quarterly user acquisition metrics. The data was printed on heavy, unbending paper. The charts displayed a flawless, relentless upward trajectory. The engagement numbers were pristine. The churn rate was virtually non-existent. It was the undeniable mathematical proof of a ruthlessly efficient machine. I placed my palm flat over the document and slid it slowly across the glass table. It came to a rest directly over Diana's leather notebook, covering Victoria's whispered lies with raw, undisputed truth. I kept my gaze locked on Diana's face. The numbers speak for themselves, I said. My voice was chillingly calm, devoid of any emotional tremor. If you require further reassurance regarding my stability, you are welcome to audit the raw data. Otherwise, I have a server migration to supervise. Diana looked down at the pristine chart. She studied the aggressive growth curve, the flawless projections, the sheer, undeniable competence radiating from the spreadsheet. She looked back up at me, and the silence stretched out for 10 long seconds. Then the corner of her mouth twitched. The twitch grew into a genuine appreciative smile. It was the smile of a predator recognizing another predator in the wild. "Your sister underestimated you," Diana said softly, tapping the paper with her index finger. "She thought you would panic. She thought you would bleed. You are far more dangerous than she realizes, Audrey. Keep the bridge loan. Finish the migration. Go ring that bell." I stood up, buttoned my trench coat, and nodded once. "Thank you, Diana. Have a good evening." I walked out of the Soho headquarters and onto the rain-slicked pavement. The city lights reflected in the puddles, blurring into ribbons of neon and gold. The cold air rushed into my lungs, cleansing the residue of the betrayal. The emotional tether to my family had snapped completely, leaving me weightless. I stopped under the glow of a street lamp and pulled my cell phone from my pocket. I opened my contacts list and navigated to Victoria's name. I stared at the digital letters for a moment, thinking about the mahogany desk, the silver pen, and the decades of systematic suppression. I pressed the options menu. I selected block caller. I repeated the process for my father and my mother. I severed the digital arteries connecting me to their judgment. They were accustomed to possessing unlimited access to my life. They were used to demanding my attention, treating me as a convenient punching bag to elevate their own status. That access was now permanently revoked. I dropped the phone back into my pocket. The heavy iron gate had swung shut and the lock had engaged. My family was officially trapped on the outside, entirely blind to the impending explosion. They would not receive another warning. They would not get another chance to sabotage the launch. The next time they heard my name, it would be broadcast across every financial news network on the planet. I turned my collar up against the wind and began the long walk back to Brooklyn, preparing for the grueling roadshow that awaited me at dawn. The next 14 days blurred into a grueling marathon of pressurized cabins, windowless boardrooms, and lukewarm coffee in paper cups. The initial public offering roadshow was a synchronized, relentless machine designed to test a founder's endurance. I traveled through 4 time zones in less than a week, pitching my software to institutional investors, hedge fund managers, and sovereign wealth analysts. These were people who managed global economies. They did not care about my last name. They did not care about country club memberships or vintage watches. They only cared about algorithmic latency, user acquisition costs, and revenue multiples. In a polished oak conference room in Boston, a skeptical portfolio manager tried to dismantle my projected growth model. He leaned across the table, attempting to rattle me with rapid-fire inquiries about regulatory compliance. I did not flinch. I recited the statutory codes from memory, paired with our proprietary risk mitigation data. I watched his skepticism dissolve into calculating respect. In San Francisco, a room full of seasoned venture capitalists interrogated my long-term scaling strategy. I walked them through the architecture piece by piece, stripping away the marketing jargon and delivering raw, unvarnished mathematics. By the end of the hour, they were fighting over institutional allocation brackets. I was operating at the very pinnacle of high finance, defending a 9-figure valuation against the sharpest minds in the industry. It was exhausting, but it was also the most exhilarating period of my life. For the first time, I was being measured by a ruler that actually made sense. My family, however, remained blissfully trapped in their own microscopic reality. Because I had blocked their phone numbers, they had lost their primary method of demanding my attention. But my mother, Evelyn, was a woman who viewed boundaries as mere suggestions. She circumvented the phone block by funneling her daily commands into my personal email inbox. The messages slipped past my spam filters, landing right next to encrypted term sheets and federal compliance updates. I sat in a private aviation lounge on the tarmac of Chicago O'Hare, waiting for a refueling delay to clear. The rain lashed against the thick reinforced glass, blurring the flashing lights of the baggage carts outside. The room smelled of expensive leather and jet fuel. I rested in a deep armchair, holding a printed document from a prestigious sovereign wealth fund. The numbers on the page represented an influx of capital so significant it would secure my company's operational runway for the next decade. My laptop rested on the low table beside me. The screen lit up with a new notification chime. An email from Evelyn Sinclair. I opened the message, keeping my breathing steady. My mother was currently consumed by the planning of Victoria's upcoming anniversary party at the Westchester Country Club. Victoria's marriage to the commodities trader was the crowning social achievement of my parents' lives, and they treated the anniversary like a royal jubilee. When Victoria got married, I had been seated near the kitchen doors, treated less like a sister and more like an inconvenient guest. Now, my mother expected me to function as her unpaid personal assistant for the anniversary preparations. The text of the email was brief, sharp, and dripping with the casual disdain I had endured for 32 years. Audrey, the caterer, needs the final head count by tonight. Since you do not have a real schedule, I need you to pick up Victoria's dry cleaning from the tailor on Madison Avenue by 4 o'clock this afternoon. Do not make her wait. I sat in the quiet luxury of the tarmac lounge, listening to the rain beat against the glass. I looked down at the Sovereign Wealth term sheet in my lap. I was hours away from finalizing a financial maneuver that would alter the trajectory of global digital banking. I held the livelihoods of 80 employees in my hands. I was navigating federal securities regulations and managing hundreds of millions of dollars in institutional demand. And my mother was ordering me to fetch my sister's dry cleaning because she believed my time possessed zero value. The juxtaposition was so profound it bordered on comedy. I stared at the glowing pixels on the screen, waiting for the familiar knot of resentment to tighten in my chest. I waited for the urge to draft a blistering reply outlining my actual schedule. I waited for the childhood desire to prove her wrong, to beg for her to recognize my achievements. Nothing happened. The knot was gone. The desire to explain myself had evaporated. Looking at that petty, demanding email, I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of liberation wash over me. It felt like stepping out of a cramped, stifling room into the open air. My family was not malicious because they misunderstood me. They were malicious because they were terrified of anything that existed outside their fragile, constructed hierarchy. They needed me to fetch the dry cleaning because if I was merely an errand girl, their empire of legacy titles and inherited wealth remained secure. If they acknowledged the magnitude of what I was building out here in the real world, their own accomplishments would look remarkably small. I realized in that quiet lounge that I had outgrown them entirely. They were playing a trivial game in a shrinking sandbox, while I was busy reshaping the entire beach. I moved the cursor over the email. I did not reply. I did not save it. I pressed the delete key and watched the message vanish into the digital void. I closed the laptop, plunging the screen into darkness. I picked up the term sheet, reached for my pen, and signed my name on the dotted line. The final leg of the roadshow concluded without a single flaw. The syndicate closed the order book. The offering was heavily oversubscribed. The institutional demand drove our listing price to the absolute ceiling of our projected range. I flew back into New York on a late evening flight. The city sparkled beneath the descending aircraft, a sprawling grid of relentless ambition. I bypassed my Brooklyn apartment, dropping my luggage at the office, and walked down to the southern tip of Manhattan. The eve of the initial public offering is a strange, solitary liminal space for a founder. The grueling work is finished, but the public reality has not yet begun. I needed to stand near the water. I needed to feel the history of the city that had shaped me. I walked along the promenade at the Battery. The midnight wind coming off the harbor was bitter and sharp-smelling of salt and wet asphalt. The park was mostly empty, saving a few late-night tourists bundled in heavy coats. I walked right up to the iron railing and curled my hands around the cold metal. Out in the dark, churning water, the Statue of Liberty stood, illuminated against the night sky. The pale green copper glowed like a beacon. It was the ultimate, enduring symbol of New York's underlying promise. The city did not care about your pedigree. The city did not care about your father's country club or your sister's vintage watch. The city only cared about what you could build with your own two hands. It was a raw, unforgiving meritocracy. I stood at the edge of the island, letting the freezing wind whip my hair back. I thought about the windowless office in Brooklyn. I thought about the thousands of hours spent writing code in the dark while my family clinked crystal glasses in midtown restaurants. I thought about the bridge loan, the sabotage, the unread emails, and the constant suffocating weight of their low expectations. They had tried to bury me in their shadows. They had tried to starve me of resources and drown me in their disdain. But they had made one critical miscalculation. They did not realize that the dark was the perfect place to forge an empire. Tomorrow morning the sun would rise over the East River. Tomorrow morning the opening bell would echo across the trading floor. Tomorrow morning the entire financial sector would assign a precise, undeniable numeric value to my worth. And the shockwave of that number would shatter my family's delicate illusion forever. I released my grip on the freezing iron railing. I turned my back to the harbor and began the long walk uptown toward the glowing canyons of Wall Street, ready to step into the light. The crisp morning air of Westchester County smelled of pine needles and damp earth. Richard Sinclair stood on the 16th tee box of his exclusive country club, enjoying the precise geometry of his life. He adjusted his pristine white leather glove, gripping his titanium driver. He swung. The satisfying crack of metal against urethane echoed across the fairway. His ball sailed straight down the center, landing perfectly on the manicured green. Richard operated on a strict philosophy of returns. Every investment required a dividend. He applied this logic to real estate equity portfolios and his own children. Victoria was a blue-chip stock paying out reliable social dividends. Audrey was a junk bond he had written off years ago. He recalled her pathetic visit to his study asking for a signature. He had delivered the harsh reality she needed to hear. He felt a profound sense of paternal duty about that rejection. It was the medicine she required to abandon her digital pipe dream and conform to a respectable path. His playing partner Preston Cole, a senior managing director at a top-tier private equity firm, watched the drive with an appreciative nod. Preston was a man who moved markets, a heavy hitter in the circles Richard desperately fought to maintain his standing within. Playing 18 holes with Preston was a calculated maneuver to project financial stability, despite the hidden rot currently eating away at Richard's own estate. They walked down the fairway, their spiked shoes crunching softly against the morning grass. Preston leaned on his iron, a casual smile on his face. "I have to say, Richard, it is going to be a monumental week for the Sinclair name. You must be bursting with pride." Richard puffed his chest out slightly. His mind instantly went to Victoria. He assumed Preston had caught wind of Victoria's recent promotion, or perhaps a whispered merger her legacy bank was quietly structuring. Richard offered a modest, practiced smile. "We are very proud, Preston," he replied smoothly. "She has worked tirelessly for this. We always knew she had the right pedigree. It takes a certain ruthlessness to survive in those legacy institutions. You cannot teach that kind of ambition." Preston stopped walking. He rested his golf club against his hip and looked at Richard with a deeply furrowed brow. "Legacy institutions?" Preston repeated, his voice laced with confusion. "Richard, I am not talking about the legacy banks. I am talking about the street. The entire financial sector is buzzing. I mean the public offering tomorrow morning." Richard blinked, fighting to maintain his polished veneer. He assumed Victoria's department was handling the underwriting for a new corporate client. "She is overseeing a very robust portfolio right now," he countered confidently. "Her vice president title is well earned." Preston let out a sharp bark of laughter, assuming Richard was displaying a dry, arrogant wit. "Very funny, Richard, playing it close to the vest, but you do not need to hide it from me. We reviewed the prospectus last night. It is the most aggressive, disruptive financial technology debut of the decade. The oversubscription rate is staggering." Richard felt a strange tightness in his chest. A cold, invisible hand gripped his lungs, restricting his breath. He forced his mouth to form words. "I am sorry, Preston. Which prospectus are you referring to?" Preston stared at him, the smile fading into genuine bewilderment. "The software platform, Richard. The fintech unicorn going live on the exchange tomorrow. Your daughter, Audrey Sinclair." The name hit Richard like a physical blow to the sternum. The vibrant green of the fairway suddenly seemed to desaturate, turning a dull, sickly gray. The sound of a distant lawnmower faded into a high-pitched ringing in his ears. He opened his mouth, but his throat was entirely dry. The moisture evaporated from his tongue, leaving the taste of copper. "Audrey is running a small digital project," Richard managed to whisper. The words sounded hollow, pathetic, and dangerously out of touch. "A small project," Preston echoed, shaking his head in disbelief. "Richard, she is opening at 9 figures. My analysts are projecting the valuation will break $100 million before the lunch bell. She built a proprietary algorithm that is terrifying the old guard. You raised an absolute shark." The final 2 holes of the golf course passed in a disorienting blur. Richard swung his clubs with numb, uncoordinated hands. He sliced his drives deep into the rough. He missed a simple 3-foot putt on the 18th green. Preston offered a few sympathetic words about pre-launch jitters, attributing Richard's sudden physical decline to the stress of managing such a monumental family windfall. Richard shook Preston's hand at the clubhouse entrance. His own palm was slick with cold sweat. Richard retreated into the men's locker room, escaping the bright morning sun. The space smelled of rich cedarwood, damp towels, and expensive cologne. It was a sanctuary for powerful men. Right now, it felt like a tomb. He walked past the rows of mahogany lockers and sat down heavily on a tufted leather bench. His knees buckled slightly as he descended, losing their structural integrity. He reached into his golf bag with trembling fingers. He pulled out his smartphone. The glass screen felt freezing against his skin. He unlocked the device and opened a premium financial news application. His thumb hovered over the search bar, shaking uncontrollably. He typed the letters of his own last name. The application loaded instantly. There was no need to search deeply. The top story dominated the screen. It featured a high-resolution photograph taken during a recent investor presentation. It was Audrey. She wore a sharp, dark blazer. Her hair was pulled back in a severe knot. She stood in front of a digital projection displaying aggressive exponential growth charts. But it was her eyes that pinned Richard to the leather bench. They were calm, unbothered, and ruthlessly intelligent. It was the exact same expression she had worn in his study when he refused her the bridge loan. It was the expression of a woman who did not need his permission to conquer the world. The bold black text beneath the photograph read, "Sinclair Software slated for historic debut. Fintech founder prepares to ring opening bell. Projected valuation exceeds $100 million. The numeric value burned into Richard's retinas. $100 million. He stared at the zeros. The reality of his 32-year miscalculation crashed down upon him, breaking through the floorboards of his ego. She had not come to his study to beg for imaginary money. She had come for a simple procedural signature on a fully backed corporate bridge. She had offered him a chance to participate in her triumph. And he had mocked her. He had told her the universe wanted her to fail. He had laughed at her in a restaurant and allowed his wife to hand a future centimillionaire a $50 gift card for coffee. Richard looked around the empty cedar locker room, listening to his own rapid, shallow breathing. He thought about the hidden second mortgage on his sprawling estate. He thought about the margin calls looming over Victoria's husband. He thought about the fragile, debt-fueled illusion of his entire existence. He had spent his life demanding that his daughters measure up to his rigid, archaic ruler. He sat paralyzed, clutching the phone. The daughter he discarded was standing at the pinnacle of global finance. She held the power to buy his entire country club and bulldoze it into a parking lot. The hierarchy was shattered. The unmeasured child had just purchased the scale. And Richard knew with terrifying certainty that the debt of his cruelty was about to come due. The radiator in my Brooklyn apartment clanked a rhythmic metallic beat against the exposed brick wall. It was 9 o'clock on a Tuesday evening. The space measured roughly 600 square feet, featuring scuffed hardwood floors and a single narrow window overlooking a damp alleyway. For the past 5 years, I had poured every available dollar into server space developer salaries and cybersecurity architecture. My personal living quarters reflected the deliberate asceticism of a founder focused solely on the horizon. I stood at the narrow kitchen island, folding a clean white blouse into a leather overnight bag. I had booked a hotel suite in Lower Manhattan, near the Exchange, to avoid morning traffic. The quiet anticipation in the room felt electric. 3 sharp raps echoed against the thin wooden door. The sound broke the silence, forcing my heart rate to spike for a fraction of a second. Visitors were rare. I walked over and peered through the scratched glass peephole. Standing in the dim fluorescent light of the hallway was my mother. Evelyn Sinclair wore a tailored camel coat and a silk scarf pulled tight around her neck. She held her designer handbag close to her chest, as if the air in the corridor might contaminate the leather. She did not know her husband was currently sitting paralyzed in a Westchester locker room. She operated in a separate bubble of willful ignorance driven entirely by her own immediate desires. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. My mother stepped over the threshold without waiting for an invitation. Her signature floral perfume instantly flooded the small space, overpowering the scent of my brewing chamomile tea. She wrinkled her nose, scanning the cramped living room with undisguised distaste. She looked at the peeling paint near the baseboards. She inspected the tiny kitchenette. Her gaze finally landed on my primary workstation. Two large high-definition monitors dominated a cheap folding table, illuminating the dark corner with lines of proprietary code. She let out a long, exasperated sigh. "Audrey, this neighborhood is dreadful," she announced, unbuttoning her coat. "I had to ask my driver to idle directly in front of the building. There are unsavory individuals lingering on the corner. I cannot fathom why you insist on subjecting yourself to this squalor when you could easily accept Victoria's generous offer and rent a decent studio on the Upper East Side." I closed the door, securing the lock. "The rent here is efficient, Mother," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "It allows me to allocate resources where they belong. What brings you to Brooklyn this late in the evening?" She waved a manicured hand, dismissing my explanation. She stepped further into the room, avoiding a stack of printed financial projections resting on the floor. "I am here because we have a logistical emergency regarding your sister," she stated. "The anniversary gala is this weekend. Victoria decided to upgrade the catering menu to include a raw seafood bar. The vendor requires an immediate secondary deposit to secure the premium tier. Your father is tied up with his golf associates, and my personal accounts are pending a monthly transfer. I need you to contribute." I stood still, watching her. The sheer audacity of her request required a moment of silent processing. My mother was standing in an apartment she deemed unlivable, demanding that I finance an extravagant appetizer station for the sister who had just tried to sabotage my venture capital funding. She viewed my meager existence as a piggy bank to be smashed whenever the golden child required a shiny new accessory. The demand was not really about the catering budget. It was a tax she expected me to pay for the privilege of remaining loosely tethered to the Sinclair name. "How much does the caterer require?" I asked, leaning against the kitchen counter. $1,000, Evelyn said smoothly. "It is a trivial amount, Audrey. Consider it a sisterly contribution to the family image. You have saved a fortune living in this hovel. You must have some discretionary funds sitting in a checking account." I looked at the dual monitors glowing in the corner. Behind those screens, a syndicate of global investors had just locked in an opening price that would value my equity at a level my mother could not comprehend. I possessed the capital to buy the entire catering company, the country club, and the surrounding golf course. I was mere hours away from becoming a prominent figure in the global financial sector. My mother was standing in front of me demanding $1,000 while simultaneously insulting my home, my career, and my intelligence. She was so convinced of her own superiority that she never bothered to look beneath the surface. I reached into the front pocket of my overnight bag and extracted my slim leather wallet. I opened the fold. The leather creased under my thumbs. I did not carry significant amounts of physical currency. My financial life existed in encrypted digital ledgers and institutional holding accounts. I scanned the contents of the wallet. I bypassed the corporate platinum cards and the identification badges. I pulled out a single crisp $50 bill. It was the exact amount she had handed me at the restaurant weeks prior, masked as a coffee stipend. I walked across the scuffed floorboards and extended my hand. My mother looked at the green paper resting between my fingers. Her expression twisted into a knot of genuine confusion. "This is $50, Audrey," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "It is all the liquidity I have available right now," I told her. My voice was chillingly steady. "My assets are tied up in the business. Every cent is deployed. I cannot fund the seafood bar, Mother." Evelyn stared at the bill. The confusion on her face hardened into a mask of profound pity mixed with deep, visceral disgust. She looked from the money to my face and then back to the glowing monitors. She saw a 32-year-old woman playing a futile game on a folding table. She saw a failure who could not even produce a fraction of the cost of a luxury party. She did not see a founder preparing for a historic public offering. She only saw her own twisted vindication. Her entire worldview relied on my perpetual financial instability. If I was broke, she was successful. The calculus was that simple. She snatched the bill from my hand, her painted fingernails grazing my skin. "When are you going to grow up and get a real salary, Audrey?" she asked. The disappointment in her tone was suffocating. "You are a permanent burden. You force us to lie to our friends to cover up your inadequacy. We try to include you, we try to offer you a respectable path, and you repay us by living in this pathetic state, unable to even help your own sister celebrate a milestone. You are a disgrace to the Sinclair name." I did not flinch. I did not offer a defense. I did not pull out my phone and show her the Securities and Exchange Commission approval letter resting in my inbox. I absorbed the venom, letting it coat the walls of my mind. The cruelty cemented my resolve, removing the final, microscopic sliver of guilt I harbored about the impending fallout. I needed her to say those words. I needed her to document her contempt on the very eve of my triumph. I needed to remember the exact sound of her voice telling me I was a disgrace. She turned on her heel, her designer boots clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She grabbed the brass doorknob, twisting it with unnecessary force. "Do not bother coming to the anniversary dinner," she threw over her shoulder. "Your presence would only depress the guests." The door slammed shut, vibrating the thin walls of the apartment. The sound echoed down the hallway, fading into the ambient noise of the city. I walked over to the narrow window and looked down at the street below. A sleek black town car sat idling by the curb. My mother emerged from the building, pulling her coat tight against the cold wind. She climbed into the back seat and the vehicle pulled away, merging into the steady stream of Brooklyn traffic. I stood by the glass watching the red taillights disappear around the corner. A deep, powerful calm settled over my shoulders. The encounter had not diminished me. It had liberated me. My mother had just delivered her final insult. She had looked down upon me for the absolute last time. By tomorrow morning, her entire framework of reality would fracture. The $50 bill she had snatched from my hand was the final transaction of our old dynamic. The trap I had forged in the dark was now perfectly primed. I turned away from the window, walked over to my desk, and powered down the dual monitors. I zipped my leather overnight bag, slung it over my shoulder, and walked out the door, ready to meet the dawn. The architecture of the New York Stock Exchange is designed to overwhelm the senses. I stood on the iconic curved balcony, looking down into the belly of global capitalism. The trading floor stretched out beneath me, an ocean of blue jackets, glowing monitors, and raw kinetic energy. The ambient noise was a living thing, a low, sustained roar of voices, keyboards, and shifting wealth. It smelled of ozone, stale coffee, and adrenaline. My hands rested on the polished wooden rail. They were steady. 5 years of coding in a windowless room had led to this exact precipice. It was 9:25 in the morning. Diana Vance stood to my right. She wore a sharp, slate-tailored suit, her silver hair catching the bright studio lights rigged around the podium. She did not offer empty platitudes or nervous chatter. She operated in the currency of results. She simply leaned forward, inspecting the digital ticker board suspended above the floor, and gave a single abbreviated nod. It was the highest compliment a veteran investor could bestow. We had survived the server migration crisis. We had navigated the predatory whispers in the executive dining rooms. We had bypassed the gatekeepers. I glanced at the digital clock ticking down the seconds. The numbers glowed stark white against a black background. My mind briefly flashed to the crumpled $50 bill resting in a Brooklyn trash can. The contrast between my mother's pity and the staggering reality unfolding around me felt surreal. I inhaled the conditioned air, clearing the lingering ghosts of my childhood from my lungs. I belonged on this balcony. I had paid the entry fee with my own sweat. A floor director wearing a headset stepped beside me, gesturing toward the polished button mounted on the podium. 2 minutes, Miss Sinclair, he instructed, his voice cutting through the rising din. I stepped up to the console. A wall of photographers stood stationed on the floor directly below us, pointing heavy lenses upward. The financial news anchors on the periphery ceased their preliminary commentary, turning their attention to the bell-ringing ceremony. The energy in the room compressed, winding tighter with every passing second. Diana stepped back, allowing me the center frame. "You built the engine, Audrey," she murmured. "Go turn the key." The digital clock rolled to 9:29. The traders on the floor paused their frantic pacing, looking up toward the balcony. 10 seconds. A rhythmic clapping started near the specialist posts, spreading outward like a wave until the entire floor was participating in the countdown. 5 seconds. My heart executed a slow, measured beat against my ribs. I did not feel fear. I felt profound, chilling clarity. It was 9:30. I placed my palm against the button and pressed down. The brass bell shattered the tension. The sound was sharp, piercing, and triumphant, echoing off the ornate ceiling and broadcasting live across every major financial network on the planet. A roar of applause erupted from the floor, washing over the balcony. But I was not looking at the cheering crowds. I was looking at the colossal digital screens suspended above the trading posts. My company's ticker symbol flashed in bright, illuminated letters. The initial listing price appeared next to it. Then the numbers began to move. They did not just climb, they vaulted. The institutional demand we had carefully curated during the roadshow unleashed a tidal wave of buy orders. The stock price ticked upward with dizzying speed, rewriting my net worth every fraction of a second. The specialists on the floor scrambled to process the volume. The line on the graph formed a steep, aggressive vertical ascent. Within 60 seconds, the initial volatility settled. The algorithms found their equilibrium. The market established the true value of the technology I had coded from scratch. The stock stabilized, pinning my company to a staggering valuation of $103 million. The wall of cameras below erupted. Flashes strobed in rapid succession, capturing the moment for the front pages of tomorrow's papers. I did not cheer. I did not throw my hands in the air. I looked directly into the blinding white light and offered a serene, unbothered smile. It was the smile of a woman who had survived the gauntlet and emerged holding the crown. 30 blocks north, in the sterile, refined atmosphere of a legacy investment bank, a different kind of silence fell. Victoria sat behind her polished mahogany desk, reviewing a dense portfolio strategy. The morning sun glared off the floor-to-ceiling windows, projecting long shadows across her luxury carpet. She held her custom-engraved silver pen, tapping it rhythmically against a glass paperweight. The corner office was a fortress of traditional hierarchy, isolated from the chaotic noise of the streets below. Mounted on the far wall, a flat-screen monitor played the morning broadcast of a premier financial news channel. The volume was muted, providing a continuous visual stream of market data. Victoria preferred the background movement, treating it as digital wallpaper. She finished signing a document and glanced up to check the opening indices. Her gaze locked onto the screen, and her breath stopped in her throat. The broadcast displayed a live feed of the stock exchange balcony. Confetti rained down around a figure standing at the center podium. The camera zoomed in, filling the high-definition monitor with a face Victoria knew better than her own. It was her sister, the sibling she had summoned to this very office just days prior. The woman she had offered a back-office IT position, fixing broken hardware for a mediocre salary. The ticker graphics scrolled aggressively along the bottom of the screen. Sinclair Software debuts. Intraday valuation crosses 100 million threshold. The rhythmic tapping on the glass paperweight ceased. Victoria's fingers went entirely numb, losing their grip on the metal instrument. The silver pen slipped from her hand, plummeting toward the floor. It struck the hardwood with a sharp metallic clatter, rolling aimlessly under the desk. She stared at the monitor, her pristine corporate facade fracturing into 1,000 jagged pieces. She watched the sister she had mocked, the sister she had actively tried to sabotage, stand shoulder to shoulder with Wall Street titans. She watched Audrey smile at the cameras, radiating an untouchable power. In a span of 60 seconds, Victoria realized her entire worldview was a fragile, debt-fueled illusion. Her vice president title, her corner office, her legacy bank meant nothing against the raw, undeniable leverage of a self-made centimillionaire. The unmeasured child had just bought the ruler. Back in the chaotic joy of the stock exchange, I stepped away from the podium. Diana extended her hand, and we shook, a firm acknowledgement of a war won in the trenches. Floor officials ushered us toward a private reception suite, steering us through the congratulatory throng. I stepped into the quiet hallway outside the suite and exhaled. The residual adrenaline hummed in my veins. I reached into the interior pocket of my blazer and retrieved my cell phone. It had been on airplane mode since the previous evening, ensuring no distractions compromised my focus. I swiped the screen, deactivating the flight setting. The device did not just reconnect to the cellular network, it convulsed. The screen illuminated with a cascading waterfall of notifications. The phone vibrated continuously in my palm, buzzing like a trapped hornet. The digital alerts piled up faster than the processor could render them. Missed calls, voicemails, text messages, unread, emails. I watched the names flash across the glowing glass. Evelyn Sinclair, Richard Sinclair, Victoria Sinclair. The incoming call screen overtook the notifications. My mother's name pulsed in bright letters. She was calling. The woman who had demanded $1,000 and left me with a $50 bill was now desperately trying to bridge a gap she had spent 3 decades widening. I let the phone vibrate in my hand. I pictured them scrambling. I imagined my father staring at his golf club locker screen, my mother watching the morning news over her expensive coffee, my sister kneeling on her floor searching for a dropped silver pen. The panic radiating from the device was palpable. They had realized their error. They were attempting to salvage their connection to the Sinclair name before the entire city recognized how badly they had miscalculated. The phone stopped ringing, registering a missed call, then immediately began vibrating again. This time, it was my father. The desperation was frantic, unyielding, and pathetic. I looked at the glowing screen, observing the digital manifestation of their ruin. I felt no pity. I felt no obligation to answer. I pressed the side button, silencing the ringer instantly. The device went dark, returning to a cold, quiet slab of glass. I slipped it back into my pocket, turning my attention toward the double doors of the reception suite. Let them panic. The real reckoning was just beginning. The private reception suite overlooking the trading floor hummed with the quiet, calibrated energy of newly minted wealth. Waiters circulated with silver trays offering vintage champagne to board members and early-stage investors. I stood near the floor-to-ceiling glass, nursing a glass of sparkling water. The financial networks playing on the muted wall monitors continued to flash my name, tracking the upward trajectory of my stock. The public narrative was solidifying. I was the self-made visionary who had outmaneuvered the legacy institutions. But inside the Sinclair family, the narrative was undergoing a terrifying, rapid mutation. Bennett, my director of public relations, navigated through the crowd of celebrating executives. He wore a slim navy suit and carried a digital tablet tight against his chest. Bennett possessed the sharp, cynical instincts required to manage corporate media in New York. He rarely looked rattled. Right now, his jaw was clenched tight. He stopped beside me, tapping the screen of his device. "We have a developing situation regarding unauthorized press statements," he murmured, keeping his voice pitched below the ambient chatter. "It is not coming from our competitors. It is coming from Westchester." He handed me the tablet. The screen displayed a major social media platform. The profile belonged to Evelyn Sinclair. She had uploaded a lengthy public tribute accompanied by a grainy photograph of me from my high school graduation. It was the most recent picture she possessed. The caption beneath it was a masterpiece of narcissistic revisionism written with sickening speed. I read the words, watching my mother rewrite 32 years of history in 3 paragraphs. "Today, the world gets to see the genius I always knew my daughter possessed," she wrote. "Building a company from scratch takes a village, and I am so profoundly proud to have provided the emotional foundation and the initial seed funding for Audrey's little startup. Through all the late nights and the doubts, I always told her to keep pushing. A mother's intuition never fails. Congratulations to my beautiful visionary girl." My thumb hovered over the glowing screen. Seed funding. She had transformed the insulting $50 gift card into a foundational investment. She had taken the decades of mockery, the continuous comparisons to my sister, and the relentless attempts to belittle my ambition, and spun them into a narrative of unwavering maternal support. She was presenting herself to her country club peers as the architect of my triumph. "Swipe left," Bennett instructed, his tone clipped. "There is more." I dragged my finger across the glass. The next tab displayed an article from a prominent local business blog. The headline read, "The Sinclair Dynasty Expands into FinTech." The reporter had secured an impromptu telephone interview with Richard Sinclair earlier that morning. My father did not offer apologies for his golf course epiphany. He did not express regret for refusing my bridge loan or telling me the universe wanted me to fail. Instead, he claimed ownership of my grit. Audrey has that trademark Sinclair business acumen my father was quoted as saying. I trained her to evaluate markets without sentimentality. I taught her that survival in New York requires a certain cold efficiency. She watched me build my portfolio, and she applied those exact principles to the digital sector. I always pushed her to be ruthless. Today's historic listing proves that my demanding parenting style yielded the ultimate dividend. I handed the tablet back to Bennett. A familiar, sickening gravity pulled at my stomach. It was the old dynamic rising from the grave, attempting to swallow my identity whole. For my entire life, their reality had overridden mine. If they said I was a disappointment, I was a disappointment. Now they were deciding they were the architects of my victory. They wanted to graft themselves onto my $103 million valuation, using my success as a lifeboat for their sinking estate. They expected me to play along. They assumed I would crave their public approval so deeply that I would allow them to co-opt my narrative. They thought the unmeasured child would finally shrink into the mold they had designed for her. Bennett watched my face carefully. How do you want to handle this, Audrey? We can issue a gentle correction. We can release a statement emphasizing your independent journey without directly contradicting them. I looked out the window at the sprawling architecture of Lower Manhattan. I was no longer the girl seeking validation in a mahogany study. I was the chief executive officer of a publicly traded entity. My name was the asset. My reputation was the currency. We are not issuing a correction, Bennett, I told him. My voice was level, devoid of any familial hesitation. We are issuing a legal boundary. Get Carter on the phone. Carter was my lead corporate counsel, a man who operated with the precision of a scalpel. Within 10 minutes, he was conferenced into the secure suite. I outlined the situation without using adjectives. I delivered the facts. My parents were making unauthorized, fraudulent claims regarding the financial origins of the company. They were acting as unsanctioned spokespeople for a heavily regulated public corporation. Draft a formal cease and desist order, I instructed Carter. Address it to Richard and Evelyn Sinclair. Deliver it via priority courier to their Westchester residence before noon. Carter paused only for a fraction of a second, registering the recipient names. On what grounds do you want the warning based? Misrepresentation and tortious interference, I replied smoothly. Inform them that they have zero authority to speak to the press regarding Sinclair Software. State clearly that any further false claims regarding seed funding or operational involvement will be met with immediate litigation. Tell them the corporate entity will protect its brand from fraudulent associations. You are threatening to sue your own parents for talking to a blog? Bennett clarified, raising a single eyebrow. I am protecting my shareholders from false financial statements, I corrected him. Send the letter, Carter. Make the language chilling. The afternoon passed in a blur of board meetings and compliance reviews. The initial public offering held its unprecedented value. By the time the closing bell rang, securing my status and my capital, I felt a profound need to alter my physical reality. I did not return to the cramped Brooklyn apartment. I had no desire to see the scuffed floorboards, the clanking radiator, or the cheap folding table. The girl who lived in that space had served her purpose. She had built the engine in the dark. Now the engine was running. Instead, my driver navigated the town car toward Lower Manhattan, pulling to a stop on a quiet cobblestone street in Tribeca. 2 weeks prior, anticipating the success of the roadshow, I had quietly purchased a penthouse loft, occupying the top 2 floors of a converted industrial warehouse. It was a fortress of modern architecture and extreme privacy. I stepped out of the vehicle, carrying only my leather overnight bag. Everything else from my previous life was left behind, discarded like an outgrown shell. The building featured biometric security protocols. The discreet brass panel next to the heavy iron doors scanned my fingerprint before granting access. The private elevator ascended swiftly, opening directly into my new foyer. The space was breathtaking. Venetian plaster walls soared 20 feet high, reflecting the ambient light of the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the Hudson River. The furniture was minimalist, sleek, and deeply expensive. There were no peeling baseboards, there were no drafts. It was a pristine, untouchable sanctuary. I walked across the imported hardwood floors, dropping my bag on the expansive kitchen island. The silence in the loft was thick and luxurious. I walked over to the glass wall and looked out at the glittering grid of New York. I had severed the digital ties blocking their phone numbers. I had severed the legal ties issuing the cease and desist. Now I had severed the physical ties, elevating myself into a fortress they could not breach without an invitation. I poured a glass of cold water, letting the reality of the day settle into my bones. The trap was fully sprung. The perimeter was secured. They could no longer claim me. But as I watched the taillights streak along the West Side Highway, I knew the silence would not last. Narcissists do not retreat when they are cornered by the truth. They escalate. Deprived of their ability to manipulate the press and locked out of my digital sphere, they would inevitably resort to their final tactic: desperation. I set the glass down on the marble counter. I was ready for them. 7 days had passed since the opening bell echoed across the trading floor. 168 hours of sustained market validation had permanently rewritten the trajectory of my life. My company's stock remained buoyant, holding steady above the initial projections. I spent the week restructuring my executive team, conducting remote interviews, and adjusting to the surreal gravity of my new net worth. It was a Thursday evening. The sky above Manhattan had turned a deep, bruised purple, releasing a steady, freezing rain that slicked the city streets. I stood in the center of my Tribeca penthouse holding a crystal glass of sparkling water. The temperature inside the loft was perfectly regulated. The cavernous living space smelled faintly of fresh eucalyptus and polished marble. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unbroken panoramic view of the Hudson River. Down below, the headlights of passing vehicles formed long red and white ribbons in the dark. Up here, the noise of the metropolis was reduced to a soft, ambient hum. I felt a profound sense of isolation, and it was entirely by design. My digital boundaries held firm. The cease and desist letter delivered by my corporate attorneys had effectively silenced my parents. Their fraudulent social media posts had vanished. The local business blogs published retractions. My phone no longer vibrated with their frantic demands. I had successfully insulated my empire from their toxicity. Then the brass intercom panel, mounted on the Venetian plaster wall, chimed. The sound was a crisp digital tone cutting through the quiet serenity of the loft. I set my glass down on the marble kitchen island. I walked over and pressed the silver receiver button. Miss Sinclair, the voice of Thomas, the evening concierge, filtered through the speaker. I apologize for the interruption at this hour. You have 3 unauthorized guests in the main lobby. They are insisting on seeing you. A Mr. and Mrs. Sinclair, accompanied by a younger woman. They claim it is a severe family emergency. I informed them that you require prior appointments, but they are refusing to vacate the premises. Shall I contact building security to have them escorted out? I looked at the glowing button under my finger. My family had bypassed the blocked phone numbers and the legal warnings by physically arriving at my fortress. They were standing in a marble lobby demanding access, using the word emergency to manipulate a stranger. My initial instinct was to tell Thomas to call security. It would be a clean, clinical rejection. It would leave them standing on a wet cobblestone street, locked out in the cold rain. But a deeper, colder instinct overrode that thought. Sending them away would only delay the inevitable confrontation. They would return, they would corner me outside my office, or ambush me at a corporate event. If this cycle was going to end permanently, it needed to end on my terms. It needed to happen inside the fortress they could never afford to build. Allow them access, Thomas, I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. Send them up in the private elevator. Understood, Miss Sinclair, he confirmed. I released the button. The intercom went silent. I had exactly 2 minutes before the elevator completed its ascent to the penthouse level. I did not rush to check my appearance in a mirror. I did not tidy the pristine living space. I simply walked back to the kitchen island, picked up my sparkling water, and waited. The heavy steel doors of the private elevator hummed as they engaged. I watched the brushed metal slide apart, revealing the illuminated cab. My parents and my sister stepped over the threshold, and the visual contrast was jarring. They looked like strangers. They looked like refugees seeking asylum rather than conquerors surveying their domain. The freezing rain had taken a toll on their carefully curated appearances. My father wore a damp wool trench coat that seemed to hang loosely on his frame. His shoulders were rounded, lacking their usual imposing posture. My mother clutched a wet umbrella, her silk scarf plastered to her neck. Her hair, normally styled into a flawless, rigid helmet, hung limp around her face. Behind them stood Victoria, the golden child, the Legacy Bank vice president who had offered me a back-office job with a patronizing smile. Her aura of bulletproof corporate dominance was entirely shattered. She wore no makeup, her eyes were swollen and shadowed with deep purple circles. She stared at the imported hardwood floor, refusing to make eye contact with me. They stood huddled in the foyer of a residence that cost more than their combined financial portfolios. My mother stepped forward, and her eyes began to dart around the room. I watched her internal calculator short-circuit in real time. Evelyn Sinclair possessed a mind trained to appraise the monetary value of any given environment within seconds. She assessed country clubs, luxury vehicles, and vacation homes, measuring them against her own assets to establish dominance. She looked at the seamless Venetian plaster spanning the 20-foot walls. She scrutinized the custom lighting fixtures, the imported marble countertops, and the sweeping, unobstructed view of the glittering skyline. She tried to find a flaw. She tried to locate a peeling baseboard or a cramped corner she could insult. She searched for something, anything, that would allow her to retain her familiar position of superiority. She found nothing. The sheer scale and immaculate luxury of the penthouse stripped away her primary weapon. She could not condescend to this space. It was objectively, undeniably superior to her sprawling Westchester estate. The environment crushed her ego before I even spoke a word. The manufactured arrogance they usually wore like armor dissolved into the humid air of the foyer. There were no fake pleasantries. They did not attempt to congratulate me on the historic listing. They did not mention the cease and desist letter that forced them into silence. Instead, a raw, poorly disguised panic radiated from their damp clothing. Evelyn dropped her wet umbrella onto the pristine floor. The fabric pooled, leaving a dark watermark on the wood. She did not bother to pick it up. Her chest heaved and her face contorted into a mask of pure desperation. She began to cry. It was not her usual polite theatrical weeping designed to elicit sympathy at a dinner party. It was a messy, unscripted, guttural sob. Her mascara ran down her cheeks in dark, jagged lines. She pressed her hands over her mouth, her shoulders shaking uncontrollably. She looked small, fragile, and utterly defeated. Richard stepped in front of her, shielding his weeping wife. The patriarch who had polished his antique golf clubs and told me the universe wanted me to fail now looked like a hollow shell of a man. His skin held a gray, sickly pallor. The baritone voice that had commanded boardrooms and belittled my ambition was entirely gone. He looked at me standing calmly by the kitchen island. He did not issue a command. He did not offer a stern lecture on family loyalty. He held out his hands. His fingers trembled visibly, vibrating in the quiet air of the loft. "Please, Audrey," he whispered. His voice cracked, fracturing into a weak, raspy plea. "Please, we are family. We need you." I stood motionless, absorbing the sight of the rulers brought to their knees. The people who had laughed at my dreams, who had handed me a $50 gift card and called me a permanent disappointment, were now weeping in my foyer, begging for salvation. I looked past my trembling father and my sobbing mother, locking eyes with my silent, ruined sister. A terrifying question hung in the vast space between us. What catastrophic failure had occurred in the last 7 days to break them so completely? The silence in the penthouse stretched, becoming a physical entity in the room. I looked at my father's trembling hands. The man who had polished antique hickory golf clubs while dismissing my entire existence now stood with his palms turned upward, resembling a beggar on a subway platform. My mother continued to weep, her face buried in her damp hands, leaving smudged mascara on her expensive silk scarf. Victoria finally moved. She stepped out from the shadow of our parents. The emerald silk and polished armor from the French restaurant were distant memories. She wore a rumpled trench coat over faded yoga pants. Her pristine blowout had collapsed into stringy, damp strands. She looked directly at me, and the intense superiority she had wielded for 3 decades was missing. In its place was a hollow, terrifying emptiness. "I am losing my job, Audrey," she stated. Her voice was flat, stripped of all corporate inflection. The words dropped onto the imported hardwood floor like lead weights. I waited, keeping my expression neutral. A vice president at a legacy institution did not simply lose her job without cause. The board initiated a global restructuring protocol on Monday morning. Victoria continued, her eyes darting toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. The retail division is being automated. My entire department is being eliminated. They are unceremoniously dissolving the vice president tier to cut operational overhead. I am receiving a standard severance package, but it will barely cover 2 months of our carrying costs." She paused, wrapping her arms around her own torso, as if trying to hold her ribcage together. The corporate prestige she had used as a bludgeon against me was evaporating into the cold autumn air. But losing a salary did not explain the sheer panic radiating from the three of them. A severance package meant a temporary setback, not a generational ruin. There was another layer to the rot. My husband, Victoria, whispered the title, tasting like ash in her mouth. He received a margin call yesterday afternoon. The pieces began to snap together, forming a jagged, horrifying picture. Her husband, the commodities trader, who always projected an aura of invincible wealth, had been playing a dangerous game. He leveraged our primary residence to chase a volatile real estate development in commercial zoning. Victoria explained, her breathing growing shallow. He thought he could outsmart the interest rates. The market pivoted on Tuesday. The lenders demanded immediate liquidity to cover the deficit. "We do not have the liquidity, Audrey. The banks swept our savings. They liquidated the college funds, the Cartier watch, the designer wardrobes, the luxury vehicles. They are all financed. We are drowning in predatory debt. By next Friday, we will be formally evicted from the townhouse." She finished her confession and stared at the kitchen island. The golden child of the perfect metric of Sinclair's success had built her entire life on a foundation of credit and deceit. She had sat in a mahogany corner office tapping a silver pen and mocking my startup, while her own financial reality was a ticking time bomb. I shifted my gaze to my father. Victoria's ruin was severe, but it still did not explain why the patriarch was standing in my foyer holding out his hands. Richard Sinclair had always boasted of his impenetrable real estate portfolio. My father refused to meet my eyes. He stared fixedly at the Venetian plaster wall near the entrance. The gray pallor of his skin deepened, making him look frail and remarkably old. "I funded the lifestyle," he confessed, his baritone voice reduced to a hoarse rasp. The admission hung in the air, toxic and heavy. He swallowed hard, the sound audible in the quiet loft. "When Victoria married, I wanted her to maintain the standard we established," he said, each word seeming to cause him physical pain. "I wanted her to have the proper address, the right country club membership, the appearance of total stability. The legacy bank salary was insufficient to cover those societal expectations. I took out a secondary mortgage on the Hamptons estate to provide her down payment. Over the years, I quietly funneled equity from my own properties to cover their extravagant shortfalls." I looked at the man who had ordered me to fold my company because real Sinclairs did not beg for imaginary money. "The real estate market contracted," Richard continued, his gaze dropping to his wet leather shoes. "The properties are severely underwater. The secondary lenders discovered the depth of the liabilities. They called the notes. The Hamptons estate is entering foreclosure proceedings next week. The Westchester house is heavily encumbered. We have zero liquid capital remaining." The pristine ecosystem of my childhood shattered with a deafening silent crash. The Baccarat crystal, the bespoke suits, the Michelin-starred dinners, the arrogant lectures regarding traditional career paths, it was all a staggering, carefully orchestrated illusion. They had measured my worth using a ruler they had purchased on credit. They had weaponized a standard of success that they themselves could not actually afford. The irony was so potent, it almost tasted metallic on my tongue. I had lived in a cramped Brooklyn apartment eating ramen noodles and funneling every legitimate dollar into server architecture while my family sat in private alcoves drinking vintage Bordeaux funded by unsustainable debt. They had looked down on me from a pedestal built entirely of borrowed money. And now the creditors had arrived to dismantle the pedestal. Evelyn lowered her hands from her face. Her makeup was ruined, but her eyes hardened. The raw panic was slowly giving way to a desperate, twisted entitlement. The ingrained habit of commanding the room fought its way back to the surface. She looked at the expensive marble countertops and the sweeping view of the city. "You can fix this, Audrey," my mother said, her voice regaining a fraction of its former demanding edge. "The Financial News reported your valuation. You possess over $100 million in liquid equity. A fraction of that wealth would clear the margin calls and satisfy the secondary lenders. You can purchase the Hamptons estate deed outright and halt the eviction on Victoria's townhouse." I watched the transformation with clinical fascination. They had not come to my penthouse to apologize. They had not come to acknowledge my hard work or congratulate me on surviving the gauntlet they had forced me to run. They had bypassed the blocked numbers and the legal warnings because they viewed my newly minted corporation as a convenient automated teller machine. We are talking about the Sinclair reputation, Evelyn pressed, stepping closer to the kitchen island. We cannot allow the social register to witness a public foreclosure. The country club board would strip our memberships. The humiliation would be permanent. You have a duty to stand by us. Family solidarity is paramount in times of crisis. We need you to deploy a bailout. My father nodded, eagerly seizing on his wife's aggressive pivot. We supported your sister so she could maintain the proper image, he added, his tone adopting a sickening, pleading quality. Now it is your turn to support the family. You have the resources, Audrey. You can write a single check and make this entire nightmare disappear. We will handle the logistics. We just need the capital. They framed the extortion as a noble familial obligation. They expected me to liquidate my hard-earned shares, the shares I had protected through sleepless nights and predatory investors, to pay off the bad bets of a commodities trader and the vanity mortgages of a failed patriarch. They wanted me to fund the very facade they had used to bludgeon my self-esteem for 3 decades. They wanted me to buy the $50 gift card back for $10 million. The sheer audacity of the demand settled over the quiet loft. They stood, shivering in their damp coats, waiting for the unmeasured child to rescue their sinking ship. They assumed the little girl who had silently endured their mockery would eagerly purchase their love the moment they offered a chance to belong. I rested my hands flat against the cold marble of the kitchen island. The air in the room felt crisp, pristine, and entirely under my control. I looked at the 3 desperate faces staring back at me. I let the silence stretch out, allowing their frantic anticipation to peak. I prepared to deliver the final clinical blow to their shattered empire. The ambient hum of the climate control system provided a low, steady baseline to the drama unfolding in my entryway. I turned away from the shivering trio and focused my attention on the glass carafe resting on the kitchen island. Condensation beaded along its elegant neck, reflecting the recessed lighting overhead. I grasped the heavy vessel, pouring the chilled, sparkling liquid into a tumbler. The effervescence hissed a crisp, sharp sound that seemed to amplify the stifling quiet of the penthouse. I lifted the rim to my lips, taking a slow, deliberate swallow. The cold water cascaded down my throat, washing away the faint metallic taste of lingering adrenaline. I felt a profound, chilling calm. My parents and my older sister remained frozen near the private elevator doors. They resembled exquisite porcelain dolls left out in a harsh storm, their painted smiles washed away, revealing the hollow shell beneath. They had traversed the city, expecting a simple transaction. They operated under the delusion that their mere presence, combined with a few frantic tears, would activate a dormant daughterly obligation. They believed the Sinclair name possessed enough residual gravity to pull me back into their orbit, converting my hard-earned equity into their personal life raft. I leaned my hip against the smooth, cool edge of the stone counter. I did not raise my voice. I did not allow a single fraction of anger to seep into my tone. Rage indicates a loss of control, a vulnerability they could exploit. I possessed total sovereignty over this airspace. I studied the 3 people who had spent 3 decades actively trying to dismantle my spirit. 3 weeks ago, I began my words dropping into the stagnant air like heavy stones. We occupied a private alcove at a French restaurant in Midtown. You ordered a vintage Bordeaux. You presented Victoria with a Cartier watch to celebrate her promotion. I shifted my gaze directly to Evelyn, the matriarch whose conditional affection was always tied to a societal scorecard. You handed me a plastic card loaded with $50. You suggested I needed the caffeine for my late-night coding games. You evaluated a decade of my sweat, my relentless grind, my intellectual property, and you deemed it worth the price of a few roasted coffee beans. Evelyn flinched as if a physical projectile had grazed her cheek. Her mouth opened, but her vocal cords failed to produce a defense. She raised a manicured hand to her throat, her fingers trembling against her silk scarf. The memory hung suspended between us, stripped of its former arrogant context, exposed for the petty cruelty it always was. I shifted my focus to the sister cowering in her damp yoga pants. The smell of wet wool and rain mingled with the faint scent of eucalyptus permeating the loft. 2 days following that dinner, I visited your corner office, Victoria. I walked past rows of junior analysts to sit in your low leather guest chair. You tapped a silver pen against a mahogany desk. You offered me a back-office support role fixing broken hardware. You warned me to abandon my startup before I embarrassed our reputation any further. You threatened to sever my access to a trust fund I had already drained 5 years prior. Victoria squeezed her eyes shut. A solitary tear leaped tracking through the smeared makeup on her pale face. The corporate titan was eradicated, replaced by a drowning debtor unable to tread water. She pulled her trench coat tighter around her torso, seeking warmth that did not exist. Finally, I locked eyes with the patriarch, the man who had governed our lives with a ruthless iron fist. "And you," I murmured, the softness of my delivery amplifying the devastation. "I came to your study in Westchester. I requested a simple signature on a fully backed commercial bridge, a routine 48-hour guarantor arrangement to save a server migration. You sat in your leather wingback chair, polishing an antique golf club. You refused. You declared that failure was the universe delivering a message. You explicitly stated that a real Sinclair does not beg for imaginary money to fund a failing hobby." Richard blinked rapidly, his breathing turning shallow and erratic. The damp fabric of his coat seemed to weigh him down, pulling his posture toward the floorboards. The arrogant gleam in his eyes had been replaced by a hollow, terrified void. I let the timeline breathe. I laid their cruelty bare, unvarnished and illuminated by the harsh light of their current desperation. I had survived their gauntlet without a single drop of their support. I had built a fortress in the dark while they danced on a stage constructed entirely of predatory debt. The irony of their situation was almost poetic. They had worshipped a metric of success defined by legacy institutions and inherited prestige. They had shunned the raw, grueling meritocracy of innovation. Now the old guard was collapsing under the weight of margin calls and foreclosure notices, while the discarded daughter stood atop a 9-figure empire. I brought the tumbler down. The crystal base made a soft final clink against the marble countertop. The sound echoed through the vast expanse of the penthouse, ringing with dreadful finality. I crossed my arms, studying their shivering forms. "You are standing in my home," I stated, projecting my voice across the foyer. "You are asking me to liquidate my equity. You want me to buy a foreclosed estate and pay off margin calls to save the family name." I paused. I let the silence tighten around their throats, constricting their airways. I tilted my head, projecting an aura of genuine, chilling confusion. "But I do not understand," I whispered. "Wasn't my company worthless?" The word struck Richard with the velocity of a bullet. His knees visibly buckled. He grabbed the edge of a nearby console table to prevent himself from collapsing onto the imported hardwood. His jaw slackened. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving a terrifying ashen gray. The psychological destruction of his authority was comprehensive. I had taken the exact metric he used to demean me and fashioned it into a blade. I used his own ruler to measure his ruin. He had nothing left, no moral high ground, no paternal leverage, no financial superiority. Evelyn let out a faint, whimpering gasp, covering her mouth with her shaking hands. She looked at her husband, seeking the stoic protector who usually shielded her from consequence. She found only a broken man staring vacantly at his wet shoes. The illusion of their invincibility was shattered, scattered across the floor like broken glass. They had wagered everything on their curated image, and they had lost. The realization that I was not going to write a check washed over the threshold. The transactional trap had snapped shut empty. I was refusing the bailout. I would not sacrifice the empire I forged to preserve the facade they had weaponized against me. My silence confirmed their ultimate defeat, providing an answer they were terrified to accept. As the finality of my rejection settled into their bones, the panic within the family dynamic mutated. When a toxic system realizes the scapegoat has permanently escaped, the remaining members inevitably turn on each other to survive. The shared delusion sustaining their unity evaporated, leaving only the raw instinct for self-preservation. Victoria lifted her head. Her expression shifted from despair to a feral, cornered rage. She stopped looking at me. She slowly turned her head to glare at the parents who had led her into this financial slaughterhouse. The heavy silence following my question hung in the air like suspended smoke. Victoria stood perfectly still, staring at the side of our father's face. The realization that I was not going to write a check washed over her, clearing the frantic desperation from her eyes. The ATM was closed. The transactional trap had snapped shut, leaving them with nothing but the reality of their own ruin. When a parasitic system recognizes the host has permanently escaped, the remaining members inevitably turn inward to feed on each other. I watched the golden child shift her gaze from me to the people who had engineered her life. The rigid obedience Victoria had worn for 3 decades fractured. The posture that had commanded junior analysts and intimidated legacy bankers dissolved, leaving a hollow, exhausted woman in damp yoga pants. She took a slow step away from our parents, creating a physical barrier between herself and the architects of her misery. "You lied to me," she whispered. Her voice was raspy, stripped of its usual polished cadence. Richard kept his eyes fixed on the baseboards, unable to meet her gaze. Evelyn reached out a trembling hand, attempting to smooth the wet fabric of Victoria's trench coat. "Now is not the time for hysterics, darling," Evelyn murmured, her tone adopting a sickeningly sweet, placating quality. "We are under a tremendous amount of stress. We need to present a united front." Victoria slapped our mother's hand away. The sound of palm-striking wrist echoed sharply against the Venetian plaster walls. Evelyn gasped, stepping back as if she had touched a live wire. "Do not manage my optics," Mother Victoria said, her voice rising steadily in pitch. "Do not tell me to present a united front. There is no front left. The facade is bankrupt." She turned her full attention to Richard. The feral, cornered energy radiating from her was palpable. "You told me the corporate ladder was the only path," she accused, stepping closer to the broken patriarch. "You groomed me to be your perfect little asset. You handed me a spreadsheet when I was 15 and told me my worth was tied to my earning potential. You pushed me into a legacy bank I despised. You measured every single achievement by the title on the door and the prestige of the zip code." Richard tightened his grip on the console table, his knuckles turning white under the strain. "I gave you the blueprint for success, Victoria," he retorted, his baritone voice trembling with defensive pride. "I funded your education. I provided the capital to secure your social standing. I sacrificed the equity in my own estate so you could live in a townhouse you otherwise could never afford." Victoria let out a short, humorless laugh, a dry hacking sound that held zero joy. "You did not fund my life to help my dad. You funded my life because I was your favorite accessory. You needed a daughter who looked good on paper to parade around your country club. You pushed me to marry a commodities trader who spoke your language even though we had nothing in common besides a mutual obsession with status. I spent the last 10 years working 70-hour weeks in a soulless department staring at financial models until my eyes bled just to earn a single nod of approval at your dinner table." She began to pace across the imported hardwood floor, the damp hem of her coat leaving a faint trail of moisture. "I played the game perfectly," she continued, her voice escalating into a raw, serrated shout. "I followed every single rule you laid out. I looked down on Audrey just like you taught me to. I mocked her startup because if she succeeded doing something unorthodox, it meant my entire miserable existence was a waste of time. I sacrificed my own happiness to be your flawless investment, and you built the entire stage on a foundation of predatory debt." Evelyn attempted to intervene, stepping between her husband and her oldest daughter. "Victoria, please lower your voice. Your sister is watching. We do not air our grievances like this." Victoria stopped pacing and leveled a glare of pure, unadulterated venom at our mother. The illusion of their unbreakable bond shattered into 1,000 jagged fragments. "Audrey is the only one in this room who is awake, Mother. She is the only one who escaped this toxic theater." Victoria lifted her left arm, extending her wrist toward the recessed ceiling lights. She stared at the vintage Cartier tank watch resting against her skin. The gold medal gleamed a stark reminder of the French restaurant, the celebration of her promotion, and the $50 gift card handed to me across the white linen. It was the physical manifestation of their conditional love, the prize for her blind obedience. Her fingers fumbled with the intricate gold clasp. Her hands were shaking so severely she struggled to release the mechanism. She let out a frustrated, guttural growl, digging her nails into the metal. The clasp gave way, snapping open. She tore the watch from her wrist, leaving a faint red mark etched into her pale skin. She turned and hurled the timepiece across the foyer. The heavy gold watch sailed through the air and struck the pristine white fabric of my luxury sofa. It landed silently, sinking into the expensive cushions. "Fake security," Victoria sneered, pointing a trembling finger at the discarded jewelry. "That is all you ever gave me. Fake security bought on margin. You demanded perfection, and you paid for it with money you did not possess. You led me into a financial slaughterhouse and called it a legacy." The patriarch abandoned his remorse. The attack on his pride triggered a defensive counterstrike. Richard straightened his posture, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. "You ungrateful child," he snarled, launching his own venom across the foyer. "You enjoyed every second of that country club lifestyle. You happily wore the designer clothes and drank the vintage wine. You never once questioned where the capital originated, as long as your standard of living remained untouched. You lost your job because your sector became obsolete. Your husband lost your savings because he gambled on a volatile market. Do not stand in this penthouse and blame your sheer incompetence on my parenting." The words struck Victoria with devastating precision. The father who had worshipped her success was now viciously dismantling her failure. The conditional nature of his affection was laid bare under the bright lights of the loft. He only loved the returns she generated. The moment she became a liability, he discarded her with the same cold efficiency he had used on me. Evelyn joined the fray, turning her wrath on the daughter who had failed to deliver the bailout. "Your father is right, Victoria. We gave you every advantage. We poured our resources into your future. You were supposed to be the anchor of this family. Instead, you arrived shivering in the rain, dragging us down into your marital debt. You have embarrassed us beyond measure." The foyer descended into a chaotic, vicious screaming match. The three of them stood in a tight triangle, tearing each other apart with decades of suppressed resentment, hidden jealousies, and unspoken lies. The polite, high society veneer burned away, exposing the raw, ugly mechanics of their ecosystem. They hurled accusations, weaponized past mistakes, and cannibalized the very bonds they had claimed were unbreakable. I leaned my hip against the cool marble of the kitchen island, resting my forearms on the surface. I held my crystal glass, taking a slow sip of the sparkling water. The effervescence tingled against my tongue. I watched the implosion unfold with profound clinical detachment. I felt like a biologist observing a doomed culture in a sterile petri dish. The emotional tethers that had once bound me to their judgment were severed, cauterized by the heat of my own independence. I did not feel the urge to intervene. I did not feel a lingering desire to defend my sister or console my mother. A stark, beautiful clarity washed over my mind, illuminating the past 32 years. I had spent my youth believing I was the unfortunate one. I thought being the unmeasured child, the outcast relegated to the shadows, was a curse. I had watched Victoria receive the praise, the funding, and the spotlight, longing for a fraction of that warmth. Standing in my penthouse, watching the golden child crumble under the weight of their impossible expectations, I finally understood the truth. The rejection was not a curse. It was a protective shield. By labeling me a worthless disappointment, they had set me free. They had left me alone in the dark, allowing me to forge my own identity, build my own resilience, and code my own empire without their interference. I had constructed a life based on raw merit, operating in a reality where mathematics and hard work dictated the outcome. Victoria had been the true victim of their system. They had placed a golden collar around her neck, tightening it with every passing year. They fed her illusions, paid for her compliance with debt, and trapped her in a cage of societal optics. She had spent her entire existence running on a treadmill they controlled, only to discover the machine was unplugged the entire time. The screaming in the foyer reached a piercing crescendo. Victoria was sobbing openly, hurling insults at Evelyn, while Richard bellowed over both of them, demanding respect he no longer commanded. Their voices echoed off the Venetian plaster, creating a cacophony of despair that threatened to stain the pristine serenity of my home. The spectacle had run its course. I had witnessed the destruction of their false idols. It was time to clear the stage and draw the final boundary. I set my crystal glass down on the marble countertop. The sharp clink of glass against stone cut through the screaming, signaling the end of the performance. The cacophony of their mutual destruction bounced off the Venetian plaster, creating a toxic echo chamber inside my foyer. They were tearing at each other with the practiced cruelty of cornered animals. My father bellowed about ungrateful children, while my sister shrieked about stolen youth and predatory mortgages. My mother fluctuated between weeping for her lost social standing and snapping at both of them for ruining the evening. It was a pathetic theatrical display of a crumbling dynasty. I stepped away from the kitchen island. My leather soles made a soft, deliberate sound against the imported hardwood. I did not run. I did not rush. I simply walked into the center of their chaotic triangle and held up a single hand. "Enough," I said. My voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It possessed the chilling, undeniable gravity of the person holding the only remaining lifeline. The fighting stopped instantly. The three of them snapped their heads toward me, their chests heaving, their eyes wide with desperate anticipation. For a fleeting second they looked identical, sharing the same hollow, fearful expression. I turned my gaze first to Richard and Evelyn, the architects of my childhood isolation, the people who had demanded perfection and paid for it with empty promises and mounting debt. "You traveled across the city to present me with a business proposal," I began, my tone matching the icy rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. "You asked me to liquidate the equity I forged in the dark to save a Hamptons estate and a country club membership. You framed this extortion as family solidarity. You expected me to write a blank check to preserve the illusion of your wealth." Richard opened his mouth, a hopeful glimmer igniting in his tired eyes. "Audrey," he started, stepping forward. I raised my hand again, halting his advance. "I am rejecting the proposal," I stated, the words dropping like anvils onto the pristine floorboards. "You will not receive a single cent from my accounts. I will not pay your secondary lenders. I will not halt your foreclosure proceedings. Your social standing in Westchester is irrelevant to my corporate ecosystem. The empire you built is bankrupt, and you will face the consequences of your own financial mismanagement without my intervention." Evelyn let out a sharp, wounded gasp, staggering backward as if struck. Richard turned the color of wet ash. The realization that their safety net was permanently retracted hit them with staggering force. The automated teller machine was unplugged. The vault was sealed. I shifted my focus to Victoria. She stood trembling in her rumpled coat, staring at me with a mixture of terror and disbelief. The golden child who had followed every rule only to end up drowning in her husband's margin calls. "I will not save your townhouse, Victoria," I told her, keeping my voice clinical and detached. "I will not bail out a commodities trader who gambled away your security on volatile commercial zoning. Your personal debts belong to you." A fresh wave of tears spilled over Victoria's cheeks, tracking through her ruined makeup. She lowered her head, preparing for the final devastating blow. However, I continued the single word, shifting the atmospheric pressure in the room. "You have 2 children. They are innocent in this systemic failure. They did not ask to be born into a family that measures human worth by zip codes and legacy titles. They will not pay the price for your poor calculations." Victoria snapped her head up, a fragile, desperate hope flickering in her green eyes. "Tomorrow morning," I explained, "my legal team will establish a highly structured educational trust for my nephew and niece. It will contain sufficient capital to cover their tuition, living expenses, and health care until they graduate from a university of their choosing." Victoria let out a ragged, breathless sob, raising a hand to her mouth. "Thank you," she whispered the words, barely audible. "Audrey, thank you." "I am not finished," I interrupted, severing her gratitude. "The trust is irrevocable and strictly locked. It will be managed exclusively by my corporate attorneys. You will have zero access to the principal or the interest. Your husband cannot liquidate it to cover his commodity debts. The funds will be dispersed directly to the educational institutions and the medical providers. You will never see a single dollar of that money cross your personal ledger." The terms were draconian, unyielding, and entirely necessary. I was offering a lifeline to the next generation while ensuring the current generation could not cannibalize it. Before Victoria could process the rigid parameters of her salvation, Evelyn erupted. The maternal mask of polite sorrow vanished, replaced by an ugly, blistering indignation. Her posture stiffened, the ingrained arrogance surging back into her veins, despite her ruined circumstances. "This is an outrage!" Evelyn shrieked, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at me. "You would bypass us entirely? You would insult our financial stewardship by locking the funds away with strangers. We are the grandparents. We are the heads of this family. We know how to manage capital. Establishing a trust without our oversight is a slap in the face. It is a deliberate, calculated humiliation. I stared at my mother, marveling at her bottomless capacity for delusion. She was standing in my penthouse facing imminent foreclosure, and she was offended that I did not trust her with a multi-million-dollar endowment. The sheer scale of her narcissism was almost scientifically fascinating. Richard puffed out his chest, attempting to summon the ghosts of his former authority. His wet trench coat shifted, highlighting his weakened frame. "You listen to me, Audrey," he barked, his voice cracking under the strain. "I am your father. I demand respect under this roof. You will not speak to your mother in that tone. You will structure the family funds the way we dictate, or you will regret it." They were attempting to issue commands from a sinking ship. They were screaming orders at an iceberg. I did not argue. I did not defend my terms. I simply turned my back on them and walked across the imported hardwood toward the Venetian plaster wall. I approached the brass intercom panel, the same device the concierge had used to announce their arrival minutes prior. I pressed the silver receiver button. The digital chime echoed through the quiet loft, silencing my parents mid-sentence. "Thomas," I said, speaking clearly into the microphone. "Yes, Miss Sinclair," the concierge answered instantly. "My guests are ready to depart," I instructed. "Please send the evening security detail to the penthouse. Escort them down to the lobby and ensure they exit the premises. They are not to be granted access to this building ever again." "Understood, Miss Sinclair. The detail is on the way." I released the button. The soft click of the intercom disconnecting sounded like a gavel striking a sounding block. The verdict was delivered. The sentence was executed. I turned back to face the foyer. The transformation in my parents was profound. The blustering outrage drained from their bodies, leaving empty, hollow shells. The realization finally pierced their thick armor of denial. The unmeasured daughter, the girl they had mocked and dismissed, now held the power to dictate who was allowed to exist in her space. I had just summoned armed guards to remove them from my property like trespassers. The ultimate power move required no yelling. It required no dramatic gestures. It only required the cold, clinical application of boundaries. We stood in silence for 60 seconds. The only sounds were the rain lashing against the glass and the ragged, shallow breathing of the trio standing by the door. No one spoke. No one offered a final plea. The psychological devastation was too thorough. They were outmatched, outmaneuvered, and permanently exiled. The heavy steel doors of the private elevator hummed, drawing their attention. The brushed metal slid apart, revealing two large men wearing tailored dark suits and discreet earpieces. The security detail stepped into the foyer, their expressions impassive and professional. "Mr. and Mrs. Sinclair," the lead guard stated, gesturing toward the open elevator cab. "It is time to leave. Please step inside." Evelyn looked at the guards, then looked at me. Her lips trembled, struggling to form a coherent word. She found none. She lowered her head, her wet hair falling across her face, and stepped into the elevator. Richard followed her, his shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed firmly on the floorboards. He looked like an old defeated man, stripped of his legacy and his pride. Victoria was the last to move. She paused at the threshold, turning to look back at me. Her face was a ruin of smeared makeup and exhaustion, but a strange spark of reluctant understanding flickered in her eyes. She gave a single slow nod, acknowledging the rigid terms of her children's salvation. Then she stepped backward, joining our parents in the illuminated cab. The guards stepped in, pressing the lobby button. The brushed metal doors began to slide shut. I watched their faces disappear, inch by inch, until the steel sealed them away. The mechanical hum of the elevator descending resonated softly through the floorboards, carrying the remnants of my past down into the dark city streets below. I was alone in the vast, pristine expanse of my penthouse. The toxic static that had plagued my entire life was gone, replaced by a pure, ringing silence. But as I walked toward the sweeping windows to look out at the relentless storm sweeping across the harbor, I realized the most profound revelation of the evening had not yet occurred. The final piece of the puzzle awaited me in the quiet dawn. The storm blew itself out sometime during the darkest hours of the night, leaving behind a crisp, washed skyline. I stood in the center of my silent loft, listening to the rhythmic hum of the climate control system. The frenetic, kinetic energy that had filled the foyer hours ago was entirely gone. My parents and my sister were miles away, retreating into the wreckage of their own poor calculations. I walked into the sprawling kitchen and engaged the espresso machine. The grinding beans provided a grounding, earthy aroma that cut through the sterile scent of eucalyptus and polished marble. I poured the dark liquid into a heavy ceramic mug, feeling the heat transfer through the thick walls into my palms. I crossed the expansive living room and pressed the automated panel near the floor-to-ceiling windows. The heavy glass panels glided along their tracks, opening onto the wide private terrace. The freezing morning air rushed into the penthouse, biting at my skin, but I welcomed the sharp sensation. It felt clean. I stepped out onto the paved stone balcony and walked toward the glass railing. The city of New York was waking up. The sky over the East River was transitioning from a bruised purple into a brilliant, piercing shade of gold. The rising sun caught the jagged edges of the Manhattan skyline, illuminating the towering glass skyscrapers. The light reflected off 1,000 different surfaces, turning the urban canyon into a glowing geometric grid. Down below, the early morning traffic formed a steady, relentless pulse. The city did not care about the drama that had unfolded in my foyer. The metropolis operated on a continuous, brutal cycle of ambition and survival. I looked out across the harbor. The water was choppy, dark, and churning, but out in the distance, the morning light struck the Statue of Liberty. The pale green copper stood firm against the horizon, an enduring monument to the people who arrived with nothing and built empires with their bare hands. It was the ultimate testament to raw meritocracy. I gripped the warm ceramic mug, letting the steam rise against my face. For 32 years, I had carried a heavy, invisible weight in my chest. I had navigated my existence seeking a specific type of validation. I wanted the people who brought me into this world to look at my achievements and recognize my value. I wanted a seat at their table. I wanted them to pour me a glass of vintage Bordeaux and celebrate my intellect without conditions. Standing on the terrace, bathed in the golden morning light, I realized the fundamental flaw in my childhood dream. The table I wanted to sit at was constructed of rotting wood. The people I wanted to impress were operating a fraudulent theater. They were drowning in debt, trapped in a desperate cycle of optics and social climbing. They did not possess the capacity to love me because they did not even possess the capacity to be honest with themselves. The years I spent in that Brooklyn apartment were grueling. I remembered the sensation of staring at dual monitors until my vision blurred, tracing lines of faulty code while the radiator clanked against the exposed brick wall. I remembered the sting of early investor rejections, the polite emails telling me my vision was too ambitious for a sole founder. Every rejection had felt like a heavy stone placed on my chest, but those stones had formed the solid foundation of my current fortress. While my sister was insulated by the rigid hierarchy of her legacy bank, protected by the safety net of our father's hidden debt, I was learning how to take a blow. I was learning how to fall and stand back up without waiting for a hand to pull me. The struggle had immunized me against their cruelty. They had handed me adversity, and I had forged it into armor. I felt a strange, quiet mourning settle over my shoulders. I was not grieving the loss of my family. I had lost them decades ago when they decided a little girl with an unconventional mind was a liability. I was mourning the illusion of the family I thought I deserved. Letting go of that illusion was painful, but it was also the key to my permanent emancipation. I had not won their affection. I had not earned their genuine respect, but I had secured something infinitely more valuable. I had secured my enduring freedom. They could no longer measure me. They could no longer summon me to mahogany offices or demand my presence at country club galas. The invisible leash was severed. I turned away from the railing and walked back toward a small cast-iron patio table. I set my coffee mug down on the metal surface. I reached into the deep pocket of my wool cardigan. My fingers brushed against a small, rigid rectangle. I pulled it out, holding it up to the morning light. It was the plastic gift card, the $50 stipend for a chain coffee shop, the parting gift from my mother at the French restaurant, designed to put me in my place. It was the physical embodiment of their low expectations. They had handed it to me, assuming it represented the zenith of my financial capacity. They believed a handful of roasted beans was a generous charity for a daughter playing a digital game. I stared at the green corporate logo printed on the cheap plastic. I thought about the sheer volume of capital currently resting in my institutional accounts. I thought about the hundreds of millions of dollars tied to my name floating across the global exchange. The discrepancy between their evaluation and my actual reality was a testament to the danger of letting small-minded people write your narrative. True worth is never bestowed by people who require you to be small. It is not handed down in velvet boxes or engraved on silver pens. True worth is built in the windowless rooms. It is forged during the sleepless nights, the relentless failures, and the quiet, unglamorous grind. It is constructed in the dark using nothing but your own hands and an unbroken will to survive. I placed my thumbs in the center of the gift card. I gripped the edges with my index fingers. I applied a swift, sharp pressure, snapping the plastic clean down the middle. The synthetic material yielded with a satisfying crack, dividing the corporate logo into two jagged pieces. The transaction was finished. The final debt was paid. I walked over to a sleek steel disposal bin positioned near the terrace door. I opened my hand and let the broken pieces fall. They hit the bottom of the empty metal bin with a hollow thud. I walked back to the cast iron table and picked up my ceramic mug. The coffee was still hot, biting pleasantly against my tongue. I turned my attention back to the skyline. The sun had fully cleared the horizon, washing the city in a brilliant, blinding light. The trading floors were preparing to open. The servers were running flawlessly. The empire I built was awake and functioning, generating wealth and rewriting the rules of the financial sector. I was the founder. I was the architect. And I was finally alone. If you have ever been told your dreams were worthless by the people who should have protected them, tell me your story in the comments and subscribe to Morning Revenge because the quiet ones always get the last word. The architecture of true worth. Audrey's story is not merely a tale of financial triumph. It is a profound indictment of conditional love within the modern American family. We are often taught that providing for our children, pushing them toward elite universities, corner offices, and legacy prestige is the highest form of care. Yet, when we measure a child's value by their proximity to traditional societal markers, we do not raise human beings, we manage assets. In the pursuit of the American dream, the Sinclair family lost sight of the most foundational traditional values: honesty, fairness, and emotional awareness. They mistook a credit-fueled facade for stability and compliance for love. Audrey's journey reveals a chilling reality about family responsibility. When parents wield their approval like a paycheck, they bankrupt their own homes long before the margin calls arrive. A message to American parents: if we wish to build resilient, traditional family structures, we must reevaluate our metrics of success. Honor individuality. Do not force a visionary child into a conventional mold merely to soothe your own social anxieties. Practice emotional honesty. Acknowledge your children for who they are, not for the status they can confer upon you. Cultivate fairness. Refrain from weaponizing one sibling's conventional success against another's unorthodox path. A message to the youth. From Audrey's silent grind in a Brooklyn apartment, young people can extract a vital truth. The world, and sometimes your own blood, will demand that you remain small so they can feel tall. Refuse the contract. Build your resilience in the dark. Your worth is not determined by the people who cannot understand your vision. It is forged by your own hands, day by day, until your reality is too massive for them to ignore. The spiritual perspective on cultivation. From the lens of spiritual practice, our society is heavily burdened by the desperate pursuit of external validation. True self-cultivation requires a radical detachment from the ego's need for applause. Wisdom. Recognizing that external prestige is fragile, impermanent, and often built on illusion. Morality. Acting with deep integrity and self-respect even when unobserved and unrewarded by those around you. Resilience. Understanding that the deepest emotional wounds can carve out the necessary space for our greatest inner strength. We are culturally conditioned to believe that a parent's rejection is the ultimate tragedy, a trauma that permanently breaks a child's spirit. But perhaps the exact opposite is true. Perhaps in a family system poisoned by vanity and conditional affection, rejection is not a curse at all. It is a protective shield, the precise, agonizing mechanism required to save you from becoming just another hollow reflection of someone else's ego. If you have ever had to build your own empire because you were locked out of your family's estate, tell me your story in the comments. And be sure to subscribe to Morning Revenge because the quiet ones always get the last word. What is the one expectation you had to walk away from in order to finally recognize your own true worth?